When rivers created the world's first cities, long before anyone thought to write anything down, two rivers in what is now Iraq decided to create civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, meandering through an otherwise hostile landscape of desert and mountain, deposited rich silt across their floodplains year after year. This wasn't planned, of course. Rivers don't have meetings about urban development, but around 12,000 years ago, humans noticed that the land between these rivers, the land that would become known as Mesopotamia, literally meaning between the rivers, was particularly good at growing things. The first settlers weren't building cities yet. They were barely building permanent houses. These early communities, places like Jericho and Catalhuyuk, were more like experiments in staying put. Jericho, dating to around 9,500 BCE, had maybe 3,000 people living behind walls that were probably more about flood control than keeping enemies out, though having a wall certainly didn't hurt when neighbors got aggressive. The residents built a tower, 28 feet tall, right in the middle of their settlement. Nobody knows exactly why. Maybe for watching the stars, maybe for religious ceremonies, or maybe just because someone convinced everyone else that a really tall structure would be impressive. Humanity's relationship with unnecessary construction projects started early. The real magic happened in southern Mesopotamia, in the region called Sumer, where the rivers flooded predictably and left behind soil so fertile that seeds practically planted themselves. By 5500 BCE, small farming villages dotted the landscape. These weren't much to look at, just clusters of mud brick houses surrounded by fields of barley and wheat, with sheep and goats wandering around eating whatever they could find. But these humble settlements were incubating something extraordinary. The Ubaid period, lasting from about 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, saw these villages grow into something more substantial. The people of this era, who we call Ubaidians for lack of a better name, since they never bothered to tell us what they called themselves, developed irrigation systems that would make modern farmers jealous. They dug channels to bring river water to their fields, built reservoirs to store it, and created drainage systems to prevent their crops from drowning. They figured out that controlling water meant controlling food, and controlling food meant controlling people. Eridu, which the Sumerians would later claim as the world's first city, was founded around 5400 BCE. According to their mythology, Eridu was where the gods first gave kingship to humanity, which is a fancy way of saying someone figured out how to convince everyone else to do what they said. The city started as a small shrine surrounded by reed huts, but grew into a proper urban center with temples, workshops, and administrative buildings. The Temple of Enki, god of wisdom and water, dominated the skyline, such as it was when your tallest building was maybe 3 stories high. By 4000 BCE, Uruk was rising to prominence, and it would become the world's first genuine metropolis. At its height around 3100 BCE, Uruk covered 6 square kilometers and housed maybe 80,000 people, making it larger than most medieval European cities would be 4,000 years later. The city walls, allegedly built by the legendary king Gilgamesh, stretched for 9 kilometers. Whether Gilgamesh actually built them or just got credit because he was famous is anyone's guess, but the walls were certainly impressive enough to inspire epic poetry. The White Temple of Uruk, dedicated to Anu, the sky god, sat atop a ziggurat that rose 40 feet above the plain. Painted brilliant white with gypsum plaster, it would have been visible for miles across the flat landscape, announcing to everyone that this was a place of importance. Inside, priests performed rituals that probably involved a lot of chanting and burning things that smelled important, because that's what priests did before television was invented. These early Mesopotamians developed the concept of the city-state, independent urban centers that controlled the surrounding farmland. Each city had its own patron deity, its own king, its own army, and its own opinion about how everyone else was doing everything wrong. Uruk, Ua, Lagash, Umma, and dozens of other cities competed for resources, trade routes, and the ever-important bragging rights about whose ziggurat was tallest. The irrigation systems that made these cities possible also created the first bureaucracy. Someone had to organize the digging of canals, the maintenance of levees, the distribution of water, and the inevitable arguments about who got how much. This required planning, record-keeping, and people whose job was to tell other people what to do. Thus management was born, and humanity has been suffering from it ever since. Labor specialization emerged as a natural consequence of agricultural surplus. When you can grow more food than you need with fewer people, suddenly some folks have time to do other things. potters, weavers, metalworkers, brewers, and prostitutes, because even ancient Mesopotamians had their priorities, all found their niches in these growing cities. The potter's wheel was invented around 3500 BCE, presumably by a potter who was tired of making lopsided bowls. Trade networks developed to bring in resources that the river valley lacked. Mesopotamia had plenty of mud and reeds, but not much else. Stone, wood, and metal had to be imported from the mountains to the north and east. Lapis lazuli came all the way from Afghanistan, which meant someone was walking several thousand miles just to bring back pretty blue rocks. This seems excessive until you realize that people today will pay hundreds of dollars to have coffee beans that were eaten and pooped out by civets delivered to their door, so perhaps we haven't changed that much. The stage was set for the Sumerians to invent practically everything else that would make human society both possible and occasionally unbearable. The rivers had done their job, depositing both silt and the seeds of civilization in the land between them. The Sumerians and their obsession with making lists. The Sumerians loved lists more than modern people love posting photos of their food. Everything had to be catalogued, categorized, and written down on clay tablets that would survive longer than the civilization that created them. They made lists of kings, lists of gods, lists of professions, lists of animals, lists of plants, and lists of lists. If something existed, the Sumerians probably had a list for it, and if they didn't, they'd make one just to feel complete. Their most famous list, the Sumerian king list, claims that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, where Alalum ruled for 28,800 years. Then kingship moved to Bad Tibira, where Alajah ruled for 36,000 years. These early kings apparently lived longer than some geological epochs, which either means the Sumerians had a different calendar system, couldn't count properly, or were making things up to sound impressive. The smart money is on the third option. The actual historical Sumerian period, called the Early Dynastic Period, lasted from about 2900 to 2300 BCE. During this time, a dozen major city-states competed for dominance in southern Mesopotamia. Each city had its own personality, like dysfunctional siblings at a family reunion that lasted 600 years. Uruk was the cultural trendsetter. Uruk was the wealthy merchant, Lagash was the military bully, and Umma was the neighbor who kept stealing everyone's irrigation water. The Sumerians invented so many things that listing them all would be ironic but necessary. They created the wheel around 3500 BCE, not for transportation initially, but for pottery. Someone eventually figured out that if you turned a pottery wheel on its side and made it bigger, you could move things on it. This revelation probably seemed obvious in hindsight, like most good ideas. They invented the sailboat, the plough, and bronze working. They developed the first known system of writing, mathematics based on the number 60, which is why we still have 60 minutes in an hour, and beer. Yes, beer. The Sumerians had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and hymns to her doubled as brewing instructions. Religion and alcohol have been intertwined ever since. Their writing system, cuneiform, started as pictures but evolved into abstract wedge shapes, because drawing detailed pictures on wet clay with a reed stylus is harder than it sounds. The earliest tablets were economic records, mostly receipts and IOUs. The first written words in human history were probably something like Kushim owes the temple 30 sheep. Not exactly poetry, but someone had to keep track of who owed what to whom. Schools called edibus, literally tablet houses, trained scribes in the art of writing. Students spent years learning to make proper wedge marks in clay, memorizing hundreds of signs, and copying ancient texts. School tablets survive showing students homework, complete with corrections from teachers. One tablet contains a student's essay about how hard school is and how mean his teacher is. Some things never change. These scribes became the bureaucratic elite, looking down on people who worked with their hands while conveniently forgetting that pushing a stylus through clay all day was also manual labor. Sumerian society was organized like a pyramid scheme that actually worked. The Lugal, or big man, ruled each city-state, claiming divine authority from the city's patron god. Below him were the priests and priestesses who managed the temple's vast holdings, the noble families who owned most of the private land, and the bureaucrats who kept track of everything. The majority of the population were free citizens who worked as farmers, craftsmen, or merchants. At the bottom were slaves who did the jobs nobody else wanted to do, which was most jobs, honestly. Women in Sumer had more rights than they would have in many later civilizations. They could own property, run businesses, serve as priestesses, and divorce their husbands for various reasons including neglect, abuse, or just being generally useless. The laws of Urt-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BC, specified that if a man divorced his wife, he had to pay her 1 mina of silver. If she was a widow, he only had to pay half a mina, presumably because widows were considered damaged goods or something equally ridiculous. The Sumerians were pessimistic about the afterlife, believing that everyone, regardless of how they lived, went to the same dreary underworld called Kur. There they'd spend eternity eating dust and drinking muddy water, which sounds like a particularly bad restaurant that never closes. No wonder they focused on enjoying life while they could. They threw festivals regularly, usually involving lots of beer and dates, the fruit not the romantic kind, though probably those too. Their literature was surprisingly sophisticated for people who'd just invented writing. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though written down later by the Babylonians, originated in Sumerian poems about the legendary king of Uruk. Other works included wisdom literature, basically ancient self-help books telling people to work hard and respect their elders, hymns to gods who were portrayed as having very human personalities and problems, and proverbs that wouldn't be out of place on modern motivational posters. A sweet word is everybody's friend, could be cross-stitched on a pillow today. Sumerian science was remarkably advanced. They understood that the moon caused tides, tracked the movements of planets, and created a calendar based on lunar months with an occasional extra month thrown in to keep things synchronized with the seasons. Their mathematics included complex calculations for areas and volumes, quadratic equations, and even a rough approximation of pi. They calculated it as 3, which isn't very accurate, but considering they were working with clay tablets and not calculators, it's impressive they tried at all. The Sumerians also invented the concept of time division. They divided the day into 12 double hours, each double hour into 60 minutes, and each minute into 60 seconds. Why 60? Because 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It's an incredibly practical number for a society that needed to divide things evenly among various people. Try dividing 10 by 3 without decimals, and you'll appreciate their logic. Their agriculture was impressively systematic. They developed crop rotation, understood the benefits of leaving fields fallow, and created detailed planting calendars. The Farmer's Almanac, a Sumerian text from around 1700 BCE, gives month-by-month instructions for farming, like an ancient YouTube tutorial in cuneiform. It even includes advice about treating your workers well, suggesting that happy workers are productive workers, a concept many modern employers still struggle with. But the Sumerians' greatest obsession remained their lists. They listed everything because writing it down made it real, permanent, and controllable. In a world where floods could destroy your city and droughts could end your civilization, the ability to record and preserve information must have seemed like magic. Their lists outlasted their cities, their language, and their gods. Today we know more about Sumerian grocery prices than we do about most medieval European kingdoms. They achieved a kind of immortality through bureaucracy, which is either deeply inspiring or deeply depressing depending on how you feel about paperwork. Writing was invented to complain about grain deliveries. The oldest customer complaint in history comes from ancient Babylon, written around 1750 BCE. A man named Nani sent a furious letter to a merchant named Neo-Assyrian about some inferior quality copper. The tablet reads like an ancient one-star Yelp review, with Nani complaining about the copper's quality, the rude treatment from Neo-Assyrian's servant, and the general disrespect he felt he'd received. Neo-Assyrian apparently kept this complaint, along with several others, in his house, either as a bizarre trophy collection, or because he was ancient Mesopotamia's worst businessman. Archaeologists found a whole room full of complaint tablets in his house, suggesting Neo-Assyrian was the kind of merchant who would definitely have a one-star average rating online. But before anyone could complain about copper, writing had to be invented, and that happened around 3400 BCE in Sumerian cities. The first written symbols weren't used for poetry or philosophy, but for counting sheep, measuring grain, and tracking who owed beer to the temple. Romance clearly wasn't a priority. These early proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk are mind-numbingly boring to read, assuming you can read them at all, which most people can't because learning dead languages is generally considered a poor career choice, unless you enjoy poverty with a side of intellectual superiority. The development from pictographs to proper writing took about 600 years, which seems slow until you realize that humans had been around for 300,000 years without writing anything down at all. The early pictographs were literal drawings of objects. A picture of a head meant head, a picture of a bowl meant bowl, a picture of head plus bowl meant eating, or possibly bowl head, though that interpretation didn't catch on. These evolved into more abstract symbols as scribes got tired of drawing detailed pictures of oxen every time someone bought a cow. By 2800 BCE, cuneiform had developed into a full writing system capable of expressing abstract ideas, emotions, and complex grammar. Scribes could now write down laws, myths, medical texts, and increasingly creative excuses for why the harvest was bad this year. The stylus, originally just a cut reed, evolved into a specialized tool with a triangular tip that created the distinctive wedge shapes. Holding it at just the right angle and pressing with just the right pressure required years of training, making scribes the ancient equivalent of IT specialists, essential but slightly annoying when they explained how important they were. The Sumerian language, which has no known relatives, was the first to be written down, but it was soon joined by Akkadian, the Semitic language spoken by Sumer's northern neighbors. Bilingual scribes became valuable, translating between Sumerian, which remained the language of religion and scholarship, and Akkadian, which became the language of everyday business and complaining about that business. Eventually, Sumerian became a dead language, kept alive only in religious contexts, like Latin, but with more references to beer and sheep. Schools for scribes were brutal affairs, where students spent years memorizing thousands of cuneiform signs, copying proverbs, and learning the proper formulas for different types of documents. One surviving school text is a dialogue between a student and his teacher, where the student lists all the times he was beaten that day for various infractions including talking without permission, standing up without permission, and presumably breathing too loudly. The text ends with the student bribing the teacher with dinner and gifts, after which the teacher suddenly decides the student is brilliant. Some educational dynamics are eternal. The uses of writing expanded rapidly, once people realized they could document more than just economic transactions. Kings began recording their victories on clay cylinders, conveniently forgetting to mention their defeats. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BCE, predates Hammurabi's more famous law code by 3 centuries, and includes such progressive concepts as monetary fines instead of physical punishment for many crimes. If you knocked out someone's tooth, you paid them 2 shekels of silver, instead of having your own tooth knocked out. Dental insurance, sort of. Medical texts from this period reveal a mixture of practical knowledge and magical thinking that would persist for millennia. One tablet recommends treating wounds with honey and resin, which actually has antibacterial properties, alongside instructions for the proper incantations to recite while applying the treatment. Another text lists symptoms of what appears to be diabetes, describing patients who urinate frequently and whose urine attracts ants. The treatment involved prayer and probably didn't work, but at least they were documenting the problem. Letters between private individuals give us glimpses into daily life that official inscriptions never would. A wife writes to her traveling merchant husband, complaining that he's been gone too long and the children are misbehaving. A father writes to his son at school, telling him to study harder and stop hanging out at the tavern. A farmer writes to his landlord explaining that the floods destroyed his crops, and could he please have an extension on his rent. These sound like modern problems because they are. Technology changes, but human nature remains depressingly consistent. The Sumerian creation myth, written down around this time though probably much older in oral tradition, describes how the god Enki distributed the divine powers called me, pronounced May, to humanity. These included abstract concepts like truth and falsehood, kingship and rebellion, art and craftsmanship, and interestingly, the art of lovemaking and prostitution. Listed separately for reasons that probably made sense at the time, the me were stored in the great temples and could apparently be stolen, as happened in the myth when the goddess Inanna got Enki drunk and made off with them. Even the gods weren't above using alcohol to gain advantages in negotiations. Writing also enabled the first literary criticism. A scribe copying the Epic of Gilgamesh added his own note at the end, complaining about the poor quality of the tablet he was copying from, and apologizing for any errors. Another scribe left a note saying that the text he was copying was so damaged he couldn't read it, but he copied what he could see anyway, which explains why so many ancient texts have suspicious gaps right at the important parts. The invention of writing created the first information inequality. Those who could read and write had access to knowledge, contracts, and power that illiterate people didn't. Scribes could charge whatever they wanted for their services, because most people had no way to verify what was actually written on their contracts. A clay tablet might say you owe 30 sheep, but if you can't read, you have to trust the scribe who might have written 40 and pocketed the difference. This created a professional class whose power came entirely from their monopoly on literacy, a situation that would persist in most societies until very recently. Writing changed warfare too. Military dispatches could be sent between commanders, though the messenger still had to physically carry the tablet, and if he dropped it, the message literally shattered. Diplomatic correspondence between kings became elaborate performances of rhetoric, with each ruler trying to outdo the other in flowery language and barely veiled threats. One letter from the king of Mari to the king of Babylon includes the line, "Why do you not write to me? Are you not my brother?" which sounds less like diplomacy and more like passive-aggressive family dynamics. Contracts became increasingly complex as scribes figured out more ways to use writing to bind people to agreements. Marriage contracts, adoption papers, slave purchases, land deeds, and business partnerships were all recorded on clay. One contract for the sale of a house includes a curse on anyone who challenges the sale, invoking various gods to inflict horrible diseases on the challenger. Legal departments have gotten less creative but no less vindictive over time. By 2000 BCE, writing had transformed from a simple accounting tool into the foundation of civilization as we know it. Laws, literature, science, and correspondence all depended on the ability to record information permanently. The complaint tablets of Ea-Nasir survived 4,000 years, ensuring that his terrible customer service would be remembered longer than most kingdoms. That's either justice or cruel irony, depending on whether you were buying or selling the copper. The first epic hero who feared death like everyone else. Gilgamesh was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which raises immediate questions about the mathematics of divine genetics that the ancient Mesopotamians didn't bother explaining. He was the king of Uruk around 2700 BCE, maybe, though separating the historical Gilgamesh from the legendary one is like trying to separate water from soup. The epic bearing his name is humanity's oldest known work of literature, predating Homer's Iliad by 1,000 years, and containing all the same themes: friendship, loss, the search for meaning, and a lot of unnecessary violence. The story begins with the citizens of Uruk complaining that Gilgamesh is too awesome. He's stronger than everyone else, beats all the young men at contests, and exercises his royal privilege to sleep with new brides before their husbands, which was apparently a thing kings could do if they were horrible enough. The gods, tired of hearing complaints, decide to create Enkidu, a wild man who lives with animals and has never heard of personal grooming. Their solution to an overpowered king is to create an equally overpowered wild man, because divine problem-solving was about as logical as you'd expect from beings who flooded the world when they got annoyed. Enkidu gets civilized, the traditional Mesopotamian way. A temple prostitute named Shamhat seduces him for 6 days and 7 nights. After this marathon session, the animals reject him because he now smells like human civilization, which is mostly beer and regret. Shamhat teaches him to eat bread instead of grass, drink beer instead of water from streams, and wear clothes instead of nothing. Basically, she ruins him. He goes to Uruk to challenge Gilgamesh. They fight in the street like drunk fraternity brothers, and naturally become best friends immediately afterward. Male bonding hasn't evolved much since. The two friends decide to go on an adventure to the Cedar Forest, which was probably in Lebanon, to kill Humbaba, the giant monster guardian of the cedars. Why? Because the cedars are there, Humbaba is there, and heroes need something to do between drinking sessions. They travel for days, have prophetic dreams that Gilgamesh insists are good omens despite them clearly being nightmares about death and destruction, and eventually reach the forest. Humbaba turns out to be more sad than scary, begging for his life and offering to serve Gilgamesh if spared. They kill him anyway because mercy wasn't invented yet. Back in Uruk, the goddess Ishtar, goddess of love and war, because those two things naturally go together, sees Gilgamesh bathing and decides she wants him. She proposes marriage, listing all the wonderful things she'll give him. Gilgamesh responds with the epic's most savage rejection, listing every lover Ishtar has had and how she destroyed them all. He calls her a door that doesn't keep the wind out, a shoe that pinches the owner's foot, and basically every other insulting metaphor he can think of. Rejecting a goddess is brave, doing it rudely is stupid. Gilgamesh manages both simultaneously. Ishtar, understandably furious, goes crying to her father Anu, the sky god, and demands he send the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk. Anu points out that the Bull of Heaven will cause 7 years of drought, but Ishtar has prepared for this by storing grain. showing that even divine revenge requires proper planning. The bull descends, snorts, and opens huge pits in the earth that swallow hundreds of men. Enkidu and Gilgamesh kill it anyway, because that's what heroes do. Enkidu adds insult to injury by throwing the bull's hindquarters at Ishtar, which is probably the first recorded instance of throwing shade, or in this case, throwing beef. The gods hold a meeting and decide someone has to die for killing Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven. They choose Enkidu because Gilgamesh is the protagonist, and killing him would end the story too soon. Enkidu falls ill and spends 12 days dying while cursing everyone involved in his civilizing, including the door of the tavern, which seems excessive, but dying people aren't known for being reasonable. He has a vision of the underworld, where all the dead, kings and commoners alike, sit in darkness eating dust and clay. Even in death, Mesopotamian cuisine was terrible. Gilgamesh's grief is excessive, even by ancient standards. He refuses to bury Enkidu for 7 days, hoping he'll come back to life, which doesn't happen and probably made the funeral significantly worse for everyone involved. He tears off his royal robes, puts on animal skins, and wanders the wilderness crying and asking every animal if they've seen Enkidu. The animals, being animals, don't answer. His grief transforms into fear of his own death, because if Enkidu, who was his equal, could die, then Gilgamesh could too. This revelation seems obvious to modern readers, but was apparently shocking to someone who was 2/3 divine. He decides to seek immortality from Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. The journey involves crossing the waters of death, which sounds dangerous but is mostly just tedious. He meets Siduri, a divine bartender, who gives him the advice that philosophy students have been quoting ever since. Enjoy life while you have it. Eat good food, drink beer, dance, make love to your spouse and play with your children. Gilgamesh ignores this excellent advice because heroes never listen to bartenders, even divine ones. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, the immortal man is disappointingly normal, spending eternity sitting around with his wife being boring. Utnapishtim tells the flood story, which is basically the biblical flood, but with more gods and less moral clarity. The gods decided to flood the world because humans were too noisy, which is the most relatable divine motivation in any mythology. Akkad, the god of wisdom, warned Utnapishtim by speaking to his house's walls, technically not breaking his oath to not warn humans. Divine loopholes are the best loopholes. Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to stay awake for 7 days, reasoning that if he can't even conquer sleep, the little death, he can't conquer actual death. Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep and stays asleep for 7 days, which Utnapishtim proves by having his wife bake bread each day, leaving 7 loaves in various states of decay as evidence. Even heroes can't argue with moldy bread. As a consolation prize, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about a plant at the bottom of the sea that grants youth, if not immortality. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet, sinks to the bottom, and retrieves the plant, planning to test it on an old man in Uruk first, because even desperate heroes understand the importance of clinical trials. On the way home, he stops to bathe in a pool, and a snake smells the plant's fragrance and steals it, shedding its skin as it slithers away. This is why snakes can renew themselves by shedding their skin while humans just get old and die. The snake doesn't even have the decency to look guilty. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, empty-handed, but somehow changed. The epic ends with him showing Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman, the walls of Uruk, describing their magnificence and permanence. The walls will outlast him, but they exist because of him. It's not immortality, but it's something. The epic's message is both depressing and oddly comforting. Everyone dies, even heroes, even 2/3 divine kings, but what you build and the stories told about you might last forever. The multiple versions of the epic show how the story evolved over 2,000 years. The old Babylonian version is shorter and more focused. The standard Babylonian version, compiled around 1100 BCE, adds the flood story and more philosophical musings. The Sumerian poems that preceded both are earthier and less concerned with mortality. Each culture that inherited the story added their own concerns and fears, like a game of existential telephone. The epic works because 4,000 years later, we're still afraid of dying, still missing dead friends, still trying to build something that will outlast us. Gilgamesh was simultaneously a god-king of immense power and a frightened human facing mortality. His story survived because it's everyone's story, dressed in Mesopotamian mythology but fundamentally universal. He feared death like everyone else, which makes him the most human epic hero ever created. Akkad, and the world's first empire builder. Sargon of Akkad started life as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, which was essentially a glorified waiter with security clearance. According to his own legend, which he definitely didn't make up himself, he was born from a virgin priestess, placed in a reed basket sealed with bitumen, and sent down the river where he was found and raised by a gardener. This story sounds familiar because every great leader in the ancient world apparently needed a miraculous birth narrative. Moses, Romulus, and Sargon all supposedly floated down rivers as babies, which raises questions about ancient childcare standards and waterway safety. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon decided being a cupbearer wasn't fulfilling his destiny of world conquest. He overthrew his boss, took control of Kish, then proceeded to conquer all of Sumer and Akkad in a military campaign that lasted 54 years. He claims to have won 34 battles, destroyed city walls all the way to the sea, and made ships from Maluha, Magan, and Dilmun dock at Akkad's harbour. Nobody knows exactly where these places were, but they sound impressively far away, which was probably the point. Sargon was the first ruler to maintain a standing army, supposedly 5,400 men who ate daily before him. This sounds like a logistical nightmare, but it meant he had professional soldiers instead of farmers with pointy sticks. Professional soldiers are better at conquering things because that's literally their job. His army used composite bows which could penetrate armor at long range, and bronze weapons that were superior to the copper ones still used by many enemies. Technology advantages in warfare are timeless. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first multi-ethnic empire, stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Sargon appointed Akkadian governors to rule conquered cities, but kept local traditions and religious practices intact. This was smart because people are less likely to revolt if you let them keep their gods and festivals. He standardized weights and measures across the empire, making trade easier and taxation more efficient. The standard weight was the shekel, about 8.3 grams, which would remain the basic unit in the region for millennia. His capital city, Akkad, has never been found by archaeologists, which is embarrassing considering it was supposedly the greatest city of its time. It's probably buried under some modern Iraqi city, waiting for someone to accidentally discover it while digging a subway tunnel or installing fiber optic cables. The city was described as having magnificent temples, vast marketplaces, and walls that gleamed in the sun. Every ancient city supposedly had walls that gleamed in the sun, suggesting either widespread use of metal plating or chronic exaggeration. Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, became history's first named author. She was appointed high priestess of the moon god Nana in and wrote hymns that survive to this day. Her Exaltation of Inanna is a complex theological work that also complains about political enemies and personal suffering, making it history's first documented case of using poetry to deal with workplace drama. She writes about being exiled from her temple, wandering the wilderness, and eventually being restored through divine intervention. Whether this actually happened or was metaphorical is debatable, but the emotions feel real enough. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue related to Hebrew and Arabic, became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. Diplomatic correspondence, international treaties, and business contracts were written in Akkadian even between non-Akkadian speakers. It was the English of the Bronze Age, spread not by Hollywood movies and pop music, but by military conquest and economic dominance. Akkadian would remain the international language for 2,000 years, outlasting the empire that spread it by millennia. Sargon's reign wasn't all conquest and glory. He faced constant rebellions, which he suppressed with characteristic brutality. One inscription describes him destroying the city of Khazal-Or so thoroughly that birds couldn't find a place to nest. This seems unnecessarily harsh to the birds, who presumably weren't involved in the rebellion. Later in his reign, all the lands revolted simultaneously, besieging him in Akkad. He defeated them all, because that's what legendary kings do in their own inscriptions. His method of control involved taking hostages from conquered cities' royal families, keeping them in Akkad as guests who would be killed if their relatives rebelled. This practice, refined over millennia, would become standard procedure for empires everywhere. The hostages lived comfortable lives, educated in Akkadian culture and language, often becoming more Akkadian than their captors. Some even returned home as loyal governors, having developed what would later be called Stockholm Syndrome but was probably just pragmatic adaptation. Trade flourished under Akkadian rule. Merchants traveled from the Indus Valley to Anatolia, carrying goods and ideas across thousands of miles. Cylinder seals from this period show increasing artistic sophistication, with complex mythological scenes replacing the simple ownership marks of earlier periods. The famous seal of Ibn Sharam, a scribe, shows Gilgamesh and Enkidu fighting animals in a composition so dynamic it looks like a frozen movie scene. The Akkadian military machine was innovative in its logistics as much as its tactics. Supply lines were established to support campaigns far from home. Military colonies were planted in strategic locations to control trade routes and suppress rebellions. The army included specialized units, spearmen, archers, and what might have been the world's first military engineers capable of siege warfare. They could undermine walls, build siege ramps, and deploy battering rams, making no city truly safe. Sargon ruled for 56 years, dying around 2279 BCE. His death triggered the obligatory massive revolt that accompanies every ancient ruler's passing. His son Rimush spent his entire reign putting down rebellions with extreme prejudice. He boasts of killing thousands and taking thousands more prisoner, providing specific numbers that were probably inflated but suggest the scale of resistance to Akkadian rule. Rimush was eventually assassinated with cylinder seals, beaten to death with the very symbols of bureaucratic power, which is ironically appropriate. Mana-Hoshu II, another son of Sargon, took power and continued the family tradition of conquering everything in sight. He led naval expeditions across the Persian Gulf, claiming to have defeated 32 kings in battle. His victory stele, a large stone monument, details his campaigns with mind-numbing specificity, listing every city conquered and every bit of booty taken. Ancient kings really wanted posterity to know exactly how much silver and how many sheep they looted. But it was Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, who would take the Akkadian Empire to its greatest heights and ultimate downfall. He declared himself a god while still alive, adding the divine determinative to his name, and having himself portrayed wearing the horned helmet of divinity. This was unprecedented hubris that the gods, or at least the priests writing about it later, would not forgive. His victory stele shows him climbing a mountain, trampling enemies, and reaching toward the stars, literally and figuratively overreaching. The Akkadian Empire began fragmenting under Naram-Sin's son, Shar-Kali-Shari, whose name optimistically means king of all kings, but who spent his reign desperately fighting to hold things together. The Gutians, barbarians from the Zagros Mountains, began raiding the empire's eastern borders. Climate change brought severe droughts that caused agricultural collapse and famine. City-states reasserted their independence. The greatest empire the world had ever seen crumbled in less than 200 years. Sargon of Akkad created more than just an empire. He created the idea of empire itself. Every subsequent conqueror from Hammurabi to Alexander would claim to be following in his footsteps, usually while stepping on the necks of their enemies. The title King of the Four Quarters of the World, invented by Akkadian rulers, would be claimed by Mesopotamian kings for the next 2,000 years. He proved that a cupbearer could become a world conqueror if he was ambitious enough and had a really good origin story. His empire didn't last, but his legend did, which in the end might be worth more. The Gutians Who Came from the Mountains. The Gutians were to Mesopotamia what the Mongols would be to everyone else. 3,000 years later, except with less organization and more random violence. They swept down from the Zagros Mountains around 2150 BCE, though calling it sweeping gives them too much credit. It was more like a slow-motion avalanche of hairy barbarians who couldn't decide if they were invading or just aggressively visiting. The Sumerian king list describes their rule as chaos incarnate, claiming the Gutians had no kings or too many kings or kings whose names were too barbaric to pronounce properly, which tells you more about Sumerian snobbery than Gutian politics. According to later Mesopotamian sources, the Gutian period lasted about a century, though they controlled different cities for different amounts of time, because coordinated conquest requires coordination, which the Gutians apparently lacked. The Sumerians described them as the fanged serpent of the mountains, which sounds scary until you remember the Sumerians also described rain as the sky god urinating, so their metaphors weren't always precise. The Gutians were portrayed as destroying temples, disrupting trade, and worst of all, not keeping proper administrative records, which to the bureaucracy-obsessed Mesopotamians was the ultimate barbarism. The name Gutian itself became synonymous with chaos and barbarism in Mesopotamian literature for the next 2,000 years. Whenever something bad happened, scribes would compare it to the Gutian period, the way modern people blame things on the Dark Ages, usually with the same level of historical accuracy. The Gutians probably weren't any more destructive than other conquerors, they just had worse public relations because they didn't hire scribes to write flattering inscriptions about themselves. What we actually know about the Gutians, as opposed to what Mesopotamians complained about them, is frustratingly limited. They left few inscriptions of their own, either because they were illiterate or because they didn't feel the need to justify themselves to future archaeologists. A few Gutian royal inscriptions survive, written in perfectly good Akkadian, suggesting they weren't the complete barbarians their enemies claimed. One Gutian king, Tiglath-Pileser, left an inscription that's indistinguishable from any other Mesopotamian royal propaganda, claiming divine support and military victories. Maybe the real problem wasn't that they were barbarians, but that they were boring barbarians. The Gutian invasion might not have been an invasion at all, but rather a migration of mountain peoples, taking advantage of the Akkadian Empire's collapse. Climate records suggest this period experienced severe droughts that would have made mountain life even harder than usual, and lowland cities vulnerable. The Gutians might have been climate refugees with weapons, which sounds depressingly modern. They settled in northern Mesopotamia, while the south fragmented into independent city-states, each claiming to be the sole legitimate heir to Sumerian civilization. During the supposed Gutian domination, southern cities like Lagash flourished under rulers like Gudea, who left more inscriptions and statues than any other Sumerian ruler. If the Gutians were really the apocalyptic destroyers Mesopotamian literature claims, Gudea was remarkably relaxed about it. His dozens of surviving statues show him in peaceful poses, hands clasped, wearing elaborate robes, looking serene and well-fed. His inscriptions describe massive building projects, international trade expeditions, and elaborate religious ceremonies. Either the Gutians weren't controlling the south, or they were the most permissive overlords in history. Göbetz's inscriptions provide shopping lists for temple construction that read like ancient procurement orders: cedar from Lebanon, gold from Hahum, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Magan, diorite from Magan, and timber from everywhere that had trees, which wasn't Mesopotamia. He claims to have opened trade routes that had been closed, presumably by the Gutians, but managed to do so without mentioning fighting them. Maybe he paid them off, or maybe they were never the obstacle Mesopotamian propaganda claimed. The city of Lagash under Gudea seems to have been experiencing a golden age during what was supposedly the dark age of Gutian rule. His building inscriptions describe temples decorated with precious metals and stones, elaborate ceremonies with offerings that would bankrupt smaller cities, and a general atmosphere of prosperity that doesn't match the apocalyptic narratives about Gutian destruction. Either Gudea was the greatest optimist in history, building temples while civilization collapsed around him, or the Gutian period wasn't as bad as advertised. The Gutians did control the city of Adab, where a Gutian governor named Sium left an inscription dedicating a temple. The inscription is perfectly conventional, invoking the proper gods, using the proper titles, and following the proper formulaic structure that Mesopotamian inscriptions had used for centuries. If you didn't know Sium was Gutian, you'd assume he was just another Mesopotamian governor doing typical Mesopotamian governor things. The barbarians had gone native, or maybe they were never that barbaric to begin with. One theory suggests the Gutians were actually mercenaries employed by various Mesopotamian cities to fight each other, and the Gutian period was just when these mercenaries realized they could cut out the middleman and rule directly. This would explain why different cities were controlled for different periods, and why Gutian rule seems more like opportunistic warlordism than systematic conquest. Mercenaries becoming rulers was a recurring theme in ancient history, usually ending badly for everyone involved. The Sumerian king list gives wonderfully precise and completely fictional reign lengths for Gutian kings. Imta ruled for 3 years, Inkashush for 6 years, Sarlagab for 6 years, Shulme for 6 years, and so on, adding up to 91 years and 40 days of Gutian rule. The 40 days is a nice touch, suggesting mathematical precision where none existed. The list includes 21 Gutian kings, most with names that sound like someone sneezed while eating crackers. Whether these were real rulers or just names the Sumerians made up to fill genealogical gaps is anyone's guess. The Gutians' greatest contribution to Mesopotamian history might have been providing a common enemy for the fractured Sumerian cities to unite against. Nothing brings people together like a shared hatred of mountain barbarians. Utu-Hegel of Uruk would eventually lead the rebellion that expelled the Gutians, though expelled might be generous. They probably just went back to their mountains when the climate improved. and raiding became less profitable than herding. Utu-Hegel's victory inscription against the Gutians is a masterpiece of propaganda. He claims divine authorization from Enlil, describes the Gutians as the fanged serpent of the mountains who had filled Sumer with evil, and portrays their defeat as cosmically ordained. The actual battle seems to have been one minor skirmish, where the Gutian king Tirragan was captured after being betrayed by his own people. Tirragan had ruled for all of 40 days before his defeat, suggesting the Gutian Empire was already collapsing before Utu-Hegel's heroic victory. The inscription describes how Tirragan fled alone on foot, was refused sanctuary in Dubram, and was finally captured and brought before Utu-Hegel in chains. This doesn't sound like the defeat of a powerful empire, but rather the arrest of a minor warlord whose friends had abandoned him. But Utu-Hegel needed a great victory to legitimize his rule, and defeating the Gutians, even pathetic ones, sounded better than admitting he'd basically kicked them while they were already down. After their expulsion, the Gutians disappeared from Mesopotamian history, except as a literary device representing chaos and barbarism. Whenever something bad happened, scribes would compare it to the Gutian period. Bad harvest, like the Gutian times, temple needs repair, damaged during the Gutian period probably, wife nagging about household expenses, acting like a Gutian. They became the historical scapegoat for everything wrong with Mesopotamian civilization, which was convenient because they weren't around to defend themselves. The real Gutian legacy might be demonstrating that Mesopotamian civilization could survive political fragmentation. The cities continued functioning, trade routes remained open if more dangerous, and cultural production continued. Gurdia's statues and inscriptions from this period are among the finest examples of Sumerian art. If this was a dark age, it was remarkably well lit in places. The Gutians proved that Mesopotamian civilization was resilient enough to absorb and outlast its conquerors, a lesson that would be tested repeatedly over the next 3,000 years. Arises again with Ziggurats touching the sky. Ur-Nammu took power in Ur around 2112 BCE after conveniently removing his boss Utu-Hegel from the picture. Historical sources are diplomatically vague about how Utu-Hegel died, mentioning only that he drowned while inspecting a dam. Whether he fell, jumped, or was pushed remains a mystery that Ur-Nammu certainly had no interest in solving. The new king of Ur immediately set about creating the most organized state Mesopotamia had ever seen, which is saying something for a civilization that invented bureaucracy. The third dynasty of Ur, or Ur III as historians call it because Roman numerals make everything sound more official, lasted about a century, but produced more administrative documents than the rest of Mesopotamian history combined. Over 100,000 cuneiform tablets from this period have been found, and that's probably a fraction of what was produced. These tablets record everything from sheep births to temple beer rations, from workers' sick days to the price of fish. If someone in Ur III bought a donkey, moved a pile of bricks, or delivered a basket of dates, some scribe wrote it down, filed it, and cross-referenced it with 3 other tablets. Ur-Nammu's first achievement was creating the world's oldest surviving law code, beating Hammurabi's more famous version by 3 centuries. The laws were relatively humane by ancient standards, favoring fines over physical punishment for most offenses. If you knocked out someone's tooth, you paid them 2 shekels of silver instead of having your own tooth knocked out. If you broke someone's bone, you paid 1 mina of silver. The code even protected slaves from excessive abuse, though excessive was apparently subjective. Murder was still punishable by death, because some traditions are sacred. But Ur-Nammu's real passion was construction. He built or rebuilt ziggurats in every major city, each dedicated to that city's patron deity. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nanna, rose 70 feet high with a base covering 16,000 square meters. The structure was solid mud brick, covered with fired brick set in bitumen, engineered to last forever. It almost succeeded, surviving 4,000 years until Saddam Hussein decided to restore it with modern bricks stamped with his name, proving that megalomania is timeless. The ziggurat's construction required millions of bricks, thousands of workers, and organizational skills that would impress modern project managers. The bricks were standardized, marked with Ur-Nammu's name and titles, and produced in massive quantities. The bitumen had to be imported from Hit, hundreds of miles north. The facing was made of fired bricks that required enormous amounts of fuel in a region with no trees. Every aspect of construction required planning, logistics, and resources that only a highly organized state could provide. Ur-Nammu died in battle against the Gutians. who apparently hadn't gotten the message that they'd been expelled from Mesopotamia. His death poem, composed by court poets who had bills to pay, describes him arriving in the underworld, confused and bitter about dying in battle instead of in bed. The dead heroes greet him, but he's too depressed to appreciate the honor. Even in death, he complains about administrative failures, which is the most earned 3 thing imaginable. His son Shulgi took over and turned the bureaucracy up to 11. His 48-year reign saw the creation of the most complex administrative system in ancient history. He standardized everything that could be standardized: weights, measures, calendar, taxes, and probably the proper way to hold a stylus. He created a standing army with standardized equipment and regular pay. He established the world's first postal system with way stations every 30 kilometers where royal messengers could change horses. He even standardized hymns to himself, distributing copies throughout the empire so everyone could praise him correctly. Shulgi claimed to be divine while still alive, adding the divine determinative to his name and having temples built for his worship. This wasn't megalomania, but practical politics. Divine kings were harder to rebel against, because rebellion became sacrilege. He also claimed to be able to run from Nippur to Ur, a distance of 160 kilometers, in one day, which was either divine power or creative interpretation of what constituted running. The economy of Ur III was centrally planned to a degree that would make Soviet planners jealous. The state controlled most production and distribution through a system called Bala, which rotated tax obligations among provinces. Each province had to provide specific goods or services for specific months, spreading the burden and ensuring regular supplies. Tablets record the movement of tens of thousands of animals, tons of grain, and countless finished goods through this system. One archive from Drehem records over 10,000 tablets dealing just with animal management over a few decades. Workers were organized into crews with specific supervisors, quotas, and schedules. Tablets record work assignments down to individual days, tracking who was sick, who was absent, who was working on special projects. One tablet lists women workers with notations like sick, dead, and ran away, suggesting that even in the highly organized Ur III state, people still called in sick when they weren't, and occasionally just didn't show up. Some things are universal. The temples functioned as economic centers, owning vast estates, workshops, and trade networks. The Temple of Nana in Ur controlled thousands of acres of farmland, hundreds of boats, and countless workers. Temple records show daily offerings that would bankrupt smaller cities, hundreds of sheep, dozens of cattle, massive quantities of beer and bread. The gods ate well in Ur III, or more accurately, the priests did, while the gods got the smoke. Education flourished under state patronage. Scribal schools produced thousands of literate administrators to run the bureaucracy. Students copied classical Sumerian texts, learning a language that was already dead in daily use but remained the language of religion and high culture. Mathematical texts from this period show sophisticated understanding of geometry, algebra, and accounting. Problem texts asked students to calculate the labor needed to dig canals, the materials needed for construction, or the interest on loans, preparing them for exciting careers in middle management. The city of Ur itself was a marvel of urban planning. The residential quarters were laid out in a grid pattern with houses sharing party walls to save building materials. Houses had central courtyards for light and air with rooms arranged around them. Some houses had 2 stories and private chapels. The streets had drains running under them to handle wastewater, though what they did with solid waste is best not contemplated. Archaeological evidence suggests different neighborhoods specialized in different crafts, with potters, metal workers, and textile workers clustered together. Trade during the Ur III period reached across the known world. Tablets record merchants traveling to Dilmun, which was probably Bahrain, Magan, likely Oman, and Meluha, possibly the Indus Valley. They exported textiles, the famous wool of Ur, and grain, importing copper, stone, wood, and luxury goods. One archive records a merchant named Nasir, possibly an ancestor of the copper merchant who would later irritate customers, dealing in copper from Dilmun. Even then, his family was probably providing substandard goods. But all this organization came at a cost. The system required massive amounts of labor and resources to maintain. Provincial governors had to meet quotas regardless of local conditions. Failed harvests, raids, or epidemics weren't acceptable excuses for missing deliveries. The standardization that made the system efficient also made it inflexible. When external pressures increased and climate change brought droughts, the system couldn't adapt quickly enough. The last king of Ur III, Ibisin, ruled for 24 years, watching his kingdom fragment. Cities stopped sending taxes, governors declared independence, and Amorite raids intensified. The precise administrative records that are Ur-Third's glory also document its collapse in depressing detail. Tablets show shrinking tax revenues, desperate requests for military aid, and finally, silence as one by one the provincial capitals stopped reporting to Ur-Thir. The end came around 2004 BCE when the Elamites captured Ibisin and destroyed Uul. The city was burned, its walls torn down, its population dispersed. The lamentation for Ur, one of the most moving pieces of ancient literature, describes the moon god Nana pleading with the greater gods to spare his city, only to be told that all cities must eventually fall. Even gods couldn't fight entropy. The fall of Ur-Third marked the end of Sumerian political power, though Sumerian culture would influence Mesopotamia for another 2,000 years. They had created the template for organized government, complete with forms in triplicate and middle managers who did nothing but supervise other managers. Their ziggurats touched the sky, their bureaucracy recorded everything, and their system worked perfectly until it didn't. Like all perfect systems, it was too rigid to survive imperfection. The Amorites arrive, and everything changes. The Amorites didn't knock politely on Mesopotamia's door. They just showed up. Around 2100 BCE, give or take a few decades, these semi-nomadic people from the west started filtering into the cities of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Akkadians, who'd been running things for centuries, suddenly had new neighbors who didn't quite follow the old rules. The name Amorite literally meant Westerner in Akkadian. Not the most creative label, but it got the point across. These were people from the lands beyond the Euphrates, from Syria and the Levant, places where settled city life wasn't quite as entrenched as it was in the river valleys. They brought with them different customs, different gods, and a different way of looking at power. At first, the old guard wasn't thrilled. Sumerian texts from this period describe Amorites as barbarians who didn't know how to eat grain properly, who lived in tents instead of proper houses, and who, horror of horrors, didn't bury their dead according to civilized customs. One text claimed they ate raw meat, the ancient equivalent of leaving a one-star review for an entire ethnic group. But here's the thing about the Amorites. They were adaptable. Instead of smashing everything and starting from scratch, they slipped into Mesopotamian society and made it their own. They learnt cuneiform, they adopted local gods while keeping some of their own. They married into local families. Within a generation or two, Amorite chiefs were running Mesopotamian cities, and nobody seemed to remember all that fuss about raw meat. The timing helped. Mesopotamia, in the early 2nd millennium BCE, was fragmented. The third dynasty of Urt had collapsed under pressure from various groups, including the Elamites from the east and the Amorites from the west. The land had splintered into competing city-states again, each one ruled by its own king, each one convinced it was the most important place in the world. The Amorites filled the power vacuum beautifully. They established dynasties and cities across Mesopotamia: Isin, Larsa, Babylon, Assyria. All of these cities fell under Amorite rule during this period. And they didn't just rule, they thrived. Babylon is the perfect example. Before the Amorites, Babylon was basically nobody, a minor city, forgettable. Then around 1894 BCE, an Amorite chief named Sumu-Abuin founded a dynasty there. Babylon was still nobody for a while longer. Sumu-Abuin's successors slowly expanded their territory, city by city, treaty by treaty, occasionally by conquest when necessary. The Amorites brought something else too, a shift in how kingship worked. In earlier Sumerian tradition, kings were often seen as servants of the gods, stewards managing divine property. The Amorites, with their tribal background, had a different view. Their chiefs had always been strong leaders who commanded personal loyalty. When they became kings of Mesopotamian cities, they blended these traditions. Kings became more autocratic, more personally powerful, less bound by ancient temple hierarchies. This wasn't a violent revolution. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, like water reshaping stone. The temples still mattered. The priests still had influence, but the balance had shifted slightly, and that shift would define Mesopotamian politics for centuries. The Amorite period also saw an economic transformation. Long-distance trade expanded dramatically. Merchants from Mesopotamian cities established trading colonies as far away as Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They traded textiles and tin for silver and gold. They developed sophisticated business practices, partnerships, credit systems and contracts that would make a modern lawyer proud. Clay tablets from this era read like ancient business emails. Regarding the shipment of copper you promised, I'm still waiting. Please send immediately. Culturally, the Amorites didn't erase what came before. They preserved it. Scribes continued copying ancient Sumerian texts. Epic poems like Gilgamesh were edited and expanded during this period. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge grew more sophisticated. If you learnt cuneiform in an Amorite-ruled city, you learnt Sumerian as a classical language, the way Latin would be studied centuries later in medieval Europe. The Amorite dynasties competed fiercely with each other. Izan and Larsa, both in southern Mesopotamia, fought for dominance for nearly 2 centuries. Alliances formed and dissolved. Treaties were signed and broken. A city that was an ally one year might be an enemy the next. It was messy, complicated, and thoroughly human. But out of this competition, one city would eventually rise above the rest. One Amorite dynasty would unite Mesopotamia under a single rule for the first time since the fall of Ur. That city was Babylon, and the king who would make it happen had a name you've probably heard before. He had very specific ideas about law, order, and what happens when someone knocks your tooth out. Hammurabi's code and the eye for an eye business. Hammurabi became king of Babylon in 1792 BCE. He inherited a decent-sized kingdom from his father. Not huge, not tiny, just decent. Babylon controlled maybe a dozen cities. Respectable, but nothing that would make neighboring kings lose sleep at night. For the first 30 years of his reign, Hammurabi was patient. Almost suspiciously patient. He built temples, dug canals, managed the bureaucracy, and played the diplomatic game with surrounding kingdoms. He made alliances, broke them when convenient, made new ones. Standard Mesopotamian politics. His letters from this period reveal a king obsessed with administrative details. Make sure the canal inspector shows up on time. Also send more barley to the workers in the south, and remind the governor that I'm still waiting for that report. Then something shifted. Maybe Hammurabi got tired of waiting. Maybe he saw an opportunity. Starting around his 30th year as king, he went on a conquest spree that would make his ancestors proud. He defeated Larsa, Babylon's old rival to the south. He conquered Eshnunna to the north. He took on Mari, a powerful kingdom on the Euphrates. One by one, the independent cities of Mesopotamia fell under Babylonian control. By the end of his 43-year reign, Hammurabi ruled most of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Assyria, from the Zagros Mountains to the edges of the Syrian desert. Babylon had become the dominant power in the region. Not bad for a city that had been a nobody just a few generations earlier. But Hammurabi's military achievements aren't why people remember him today. Most people couldn't name a single battle he fought or a single city he conquered. They remember him because of a big black stone covered in writing. The Code of Hammurabi. 282 laws carved into a diorite stele, topped with a relief showing Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. The stele was set up in Babylon's main temple where anyone could see it. Well, anyone who could read cuneiform, which wasn't exactly everyone. But the principle was there. The code wasn't actually the first law collection in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians had written down laws centuries earlier. Unamu, Lipit Ishtar, and several others had created legal codes before Hammurabi was born. But Hammurabi's version was more comprehensive, better preserved, and had better marketing. Sometimes being first matters less than being memorable. The laws covered everything. Agriculture, trade, family relationships, property rights, professional standards, slavery, and a whole section on what happens when your ox gores someone. The code assumed that life was complicated and that people needed rules for every possible scenario. Some of the laws are famous. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The principle of equivalent retaliation. Except it wasn't quite that simple. Here's where it gets interesting. The punishments weren't equal for everyone. If a free man destroyed the eye of another free man, then yes, eye for eye. But if a free man destroyed the eye of a slave, he just paid a fine, half the slave's value to be specific. The code had 3 social classes: free men, commoners, and slaves. Your punishment or compensation depended entirely on which class you belonged to. and which class your victim belonged to. A free man who struck another free man's daughter and caused a miscarriage, his own daughter would be put to death. But if the woman was a commoner, just a fine. If she was a slave, an even smaller fine. Justice wasn't blind in ancient Babylon. It was very much aware of social status. The code also had standards for professional competence. If a builder constructed a house and it collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would be executed. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son would be executed. If it killed a slave, the builder just had to replace the slave. The code really liked the principle of equivalent loss. Doctors faced similar pressure. If a physician performed surgery with a bronze lancet and saved someone's life, he got paid well. If he performed surgery and the patient died, his hand would be cut off. Talk about high-stakes medicine. Though again, this only applied if the patient was a free man. Different rules for different classes. Some laws seem almost modern. If a merchant gave a trader goods to sell, and the trader claimed he was robbed, he had to swear an oath before the god. If he was lying, he paid back double. If he was telling the truth, no penalty. A basic fraud protection system. Other laws feel very ancient. If a wife was caught with another man, both would be bound and thrown into the river. Unless the husband decided to pardon his wife, in which case the king might pardon the other man too. Adultery was serious business, but mercy was possible. The code protected some rights that might surprise modern readers. A woman could own property, run a business, and initiate divorce under certain circumstances. If a husband took a second wife because the first was sick, the first wife could leave and take her dowry. Women weren't equal to men in Hammurabi's Babylon, but they weren't completely powerless either. Hammurabi presented these laws as a gift from the gods, proof that he was a just ruler who cared about his people. The prologue to the code describes him as the shepherd, called by the gods to bring justice to the land. The epilogue warns future kings not to alter his words. Typical ruler stuff. But Hammurabi sold it well. Did the code actually work? Did judges consult it when making decisions? That's harder to say. Legal documents from Hammurabi's time don't always match the code's provisions. Real life was messier than carved stone. But the code represented an ideal, a vision of what justice should look like. A king's promise that rules applied to everyone, even if those rules treated people differently. The stele stood in Babylon for centuries, until Elamite raiders carried it off to Susa as war booty. French archaeologists found it there in 1901, still intact, still readable. Hammurabi's words had survived 3,000 years. But Babylon's dominance wouldn't last nearly that long. New peoples were already moving, new powers rising, and Mesopotamia's age of constant change was far from over. The mysterious sea peoples nobody could name. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean world started falling apart. Not slowly, not gradually, suddenly. Cities that had stood for centuries burned, kingdoms collapsed, trade networks that had connected 3 continents simply stopped functioning. And wandering through this chaos were groups of people that ancient scribes could only describe as peoples of the sea. The Sea Peoples. It's not even a name, really. It's more of a description followed by a shrug. Egyptian texts mention them. Hittite texts hint at them. Ugaritic tablets reference them in increasingly panicked tones. But nobody could quite pin down who they were, where they came from, or what they wanted beyond general destruction and displacement. The Egyptians left us the best records, mostly because Egypt survived the Sea Peoples. Unlike most of their neighbors, Pharaoh Merneptah faced them first, around 1207 BCE. His inscriptions describe a coalition of foreign peoples attacking Egypt from the sea, and from Libya. He claims to have defeated them decisively. Egyptian pharaohs always claimed decisive victories, so take that with a grain of salt. The names recorded are wonderfully unhelpful. The Pelisate, the Churka, the Shukalish, the Denyen, the Wishaches. Scholars have spent decades trying to match these names to known peoples. Maybe the Pelisate were Philistines, maybe the Shukalish were Sicilians, maybe the Denyen were Greeks, or maybe ancient scribes just wrote down what the names sounded like and moved on with their day. Rameses III faced an even bigger invasion around 1175 BCE. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu has detailed reliefs showing naval battles and land engagements. The carvings show ships with distinctive prows, warriors with horned helmets and feathered headdresses, ox carts loaded with families and possessions. These weren't just raiders, these were entire populations on the move, bringing their families, looking for new homes. Ramesses claims he defeated them utterly, killed thousands, captured thousands more, stopped them at Egypt's borders. His inscriptions are triumphant, proud, and extremely detailed about how thoroughly he crushed these invaders. And yet, the reliefs tell a slightly different story. They show desperate fighting, close calls, a kingdom under serious threat. The mystery deepens when you look at what happened everywhere else. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia and Syria for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Their capital Hattusa burned, their administrative system collapsed. Within a generation, the Hittites went from major power to historical footnote. No clear enemy, no obvious conqueror, just collapse. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city on the Syrian coast, met a similar fate. Archaeologists found the city frozen in time, destroyed so quickly that people didn't have time to bury their valuables or flee with their possessions. Tablets found in the ruins include desperate letters. One message to the king of Elashia, modern Cyprus, describes enemy ships attacking. Now the ships of the enemy have come. They have set fire to my cities and have done evil in my land. Another letter, never sent, simply says, My father, the enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country. The writer sounds exhausted, defeated. Ugarit never recovered. The city was abandoned and eventually forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 1920s. The destruction spread across the eastern Mediterranean, like a very slow, very thorough plague. Mycenaean palaces in Greece burned. Cities in Cyprus were abandoned. The Hittite vassal states in Syria disappeared. Troy, already famous in legend, was destroyed. The archaeological layers from this period show the same pattern everywhere. Burn layers, hasty burials, abandoned buildings, then nothing, or nearly nothing. Trade collapsed spectacularly. The complex networks that had moved tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic, and ivory from Africa simply stopped functioning. Bronze Age kingdoms had depended on these trade routes. When they failed, the kingdoms failed with them. No tin meant no bronze. No bronze meant no weapons, no tools, no technological edge. Civilizations built on bronze suddenly found themselves without the resources that had made them powerful. Some cities survived by adapting. Tyre and Sidon on the Lebanese coast managed to keep going, though diminished. Athens somehow avoided destruction, though it shrank dramatically. Egypt held together, barely, though it would never quite reach its former glory. But vast regions depopulated. People abandoned the cities and returned to simpler village life. Literacy rates plummeted. In some areas, writing disappeared entirely for centuries. Who were the Sea Peoples? Modern theories multiply like rabbits. Maybe they were displaced populations from the Aegean, fleeing their own collapsing kingdoms. Maybe they were opportunistic raiders who exploited existing chaos. Maybe they were climate refugees escaping drought and famine. Maybe they were multiple unrelated groups that got lumped together by confused Egyptian scribes. The environmental evidence is suggestive. Tree ring data and pollen cores show a significant drought across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Crops would have failed, populations would have moved, searching for food and water. Hungry, desperate people make dangerous neighbors. Kingdoms already stressed by climate change would have been vulnerable to any additional pressure. But the Sea Peoples alone probably didn't cause the collapse. They were more like the final straw on an already overloaded camel. Bronze Age kingdoms were complex, interdependent systems. When one part failed, everything failed. The Sea Peoples wandered through the wreckage, sometimes causing destruction, sometimes just looking for somewhere to survive, sometimes both. Mesopotamia largely escaped the worst of it. The region was geographically buffered from the Mediterranean chaos. The great rivers still flowed. The irrigation system still worked. Cities like Babylon and Ashur continued, though they noticed when the trade goods from the west stopped arriving. The collapse happened around them, not to them. Still, the Bronze Age world was gone. The old certainties had vanished. The great empires that had exchanged letters and married their children to each other had fallen silent. When Mesopotamia looked west, they saw only ruins and mysteries. But Mesopotamia had survived worse. The cities endured, the fields still produced, and in the north, one kingdom was quietly preparing to become something the ancient world had never quite seen before. something efficient, ruthless, and extremely good at conquest. Assyria was about to have its moment. Assyria begins its long march to power. Assyria had always been there, lurking in northern Mesopotamia like a patient predator. The city of Ashur sat on the Tigris River, perfectly positioned for trade routes running north to Anatolia and east to the Zagros Mountains. While southern cities like Ur and Babylon grabbed headlines with their empires and law codes, Assyria quietly built wealth through commerce. The Old Assyrian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, was all about business. Assyrian merchants established trading colonies across Anatolia, selling Mesopotamian textiles and tin to local rulers in exchange for silver and gold. They kept meticulous records. Thousands of clay tablets from the trading colony at Kanesh show a sophisticated commercial network. Contracts, invoices, letters complaining about late shipments, family disputes over inheritance. The Assyrians were very good at two things: making money and writing everything down. But trade empires are fragile. When the Hittites expanded across Anatolia, the trading colonies collapsed. When the Mitanni kingdom rose to power in northern Mesopotamia, Assyria became a vassal state. For centuries, Assyria was subordinate, controlled, contained. They paid tribute to stronger neighbors and waited. Waiting, as it turns out, was excellent practice for eventual domination. While serving as a Mitanni vassal, Assyria learned about administration, military organization, and how to control conquered territories. They watched, they took notes, they remembered. The shift began with Ashurbanipal the High, who ruled from 1365 to 1330 BCE. The Mitanni kingdom was weakening, caught between Hittite pressure from the west and internal problems. Ashurbanipal saw an opportunity and declared independence. Not gradually, not diplomatically. He just stopped paying tribute and started calling himself King of Assyria instead of a vassal ruler. The Mitanni couldn't do much about it. They had bigger problems. Ashurbanipal consolidated Assyrian territory, expanded borders, and did something clever. He married his daughter to the Babylonian king. Diplomatic marriage was standard practice, but this one had consequences. When the Babylonian king died and a usurper seized power, Ashurbanipal marched south, removed the usurper, and placed his grandson on the Babylonian throne. Assyria had just interfered in Babylonian politics. This would become a habit. Adad-nirari I, ruling from 1307 to 1275 BCE, continued the expansion. He conquered what remained of Mitanni, pushing Assyrian borders west towards Syria. He fought the Kassites who controlled Babylon. He built fortresses and established the administrative framework that would support future conquests. Under him, Assyria stopped being a regional power and started becoming something more dangerous. Shalmaneser I, his son, ruled from 1274 to 1245 BCE. He expanded further, conquered more territory, and dealt with constant rebellions. Ruling an empire turned out to be harder than building one. Newly conquered peoples had this annoying habit of rebelling whenever the king looked distracted. Shalmaneser spent his reign fighting, rebuilding, and fighting again. But the real architect of early Assyrian power was Tukulti-Ninurta I, ruling from 1244 to 1208 BCE. His name meant "My trust is in the warrior god Ninurta," which tells you something about his personality. He was aggressive, ambitious, and remarkably successful at turning Assyria into a genuine empire. Tukulti-Ninurta fought everyone. He campaigned east into the Zagros Mountains, subjugating tribal peoples who'd never paid tribute to anyone. He fought north into Anatolia, clashing with the remnants of Hittite power. He pushed west into Syria, establishing Assyrian control over trade routes. And then he did something that shocked the Mesopotamian world. He conquered Babylon. Not just defeated them in battle. He physically conquered the city, sacked it, and took the Babylonian king prisoner. Then he kidnapped the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and brought it back to Assyria. In Mesopotamian terms, this was the ultimate humiliation. Gods were tied to their cities. Removing a god statue meant the god had abandoned their people, or been kidnapped. Theology got complicated during wartime. Tukulti-Ninurta ruled Babylon directly for 7 years. He installed Assyrian governors, extracted tribute, and generally treated southern Mesopotamia as conquered territory, rather than a respected neighbor. The Babylonians were outraged. So were many Assyrians, actually. Babylon carried enormous cultural prestige. It was the city of Hammurabi, the center of learning and religion. Conquering it felt wrong, even to some Assyrians. The backlash was severe. Tukulti-Ninurta's own son led a rebellion and killed him around 1208 BCE. Ancient sources suggest he was murdered in his palace, possibly while worshipping in his private chapel. The Babylonian statue of Marduk was returned. Normal relations were supposedly restored, except they weren't really. Assyria had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. After Tukulti-Ninurta's death, Assyria entered a period of weakness. The empire contracted, conquered territories broke away, internal conflicts drained resources. For about a century, Assyria struggled just to maintain what it had, let alone expand. The Bronze Age collapse was happening around them, which didn't help. Trade routes failed, allies disappeared, resources became scarce. But Assyria survived. The core territory around Ashur and Nineveh remained intact. The administrative systems continued functioning, the military tradition persisted. Unlike the Hittites who vanished, unlike Mycenaean Greece which collapsed into illiteracy, Assyria endured through the chaos. The Middle Assyrian period, roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE, had established something important. Assyria had developed a military culture that valued conquest and expansion. They'd created administrative systems that could govern diverse territories. They'd learned that empire required constant effort, constant fighting, constant vigilance, and they'd discovered they were very good at all of it. The Middle Assyrian laws from this period reveal a society that was harsh even by ancient standards. Punishments were severe. Women had fewer rights than in Babylon. The state exercised brutal control over daily life. These weren't laws designed to create a just society. They were laws designed to maintain order through fear. But that was still centuries away from Assyria's peak. Right now, they were just surviving, maintaining their territory, waiting for another opportunity. Patience and observation had served them well before. They could wait longer. Meanwhile, just to the south, another people group was settling into Mesopotamia. They would rule Babylon for 4 centuries, longer than almost any other dynasty. They weren't dramatic, they weren't flashy, but they had staying power. The Kassites were about to make longevity their superpower. The Kassites and their 400-year reign. The Kassites appeared in Mesopotamian history like fog rolling in. No dramatic invasion, no apocalyptic conquest, just a gradual presence that eventually became impossible to ignore. They came from the Zagros Mountains, the rugged highlands east of Mesopotamia, sometime during the 18th century BCE. At first they were just there, mercenaries in Babylonian armies, laborers, settlers, immigrants looking for opportunities in the river valleys. Then, after Babylon was sacked by the Hittite king Mursili I around 1595 BCE, and after the Hittites went home with their plunder, someone needed to fill the power vacuum in southern Mesopotamia. The Kassites volunteered. Or maybe they just happened to be in the right place when everyone else was exhausted. Either way, by around 1570 BCE, a Kassite dynasty ruled Babylon. They would stay in power for roughly 430 years. Let that sink in. 4 centuries. 1 dynasty. In a region where kingdoms typically rose and fell within a few generations, the Kassites achieved something remarkable through sheer stubborn persistence. Nobody really knows where the Kassites originally came from. Their language wasn't Semitic like Akkadian or Sumerian. It wasn't Indo-European either. It was its own thing, and it left almost no trace. A few personal names, a handful of technical terms related to horses and chariots, some titles, that's about it. Within a few generations of ruling Babylon, the Kassites had completely adopted Akkadian as their administrative language, and Babylonian culture as their own. This was the Kassite superpower. Cultural absorption. They didn't try to remake Babylon in their image. They became Babylonian. They adopted local gods, worshipped Marduk with appropriate reverence, supported the temples, maintained the scribal schools, and preserved Mesopotamian traditions. If you read a legal document from Kassite Babylon, you'd never know foreign rulers were in charge. But they did leave their mark. The Kassites introduced a new administrative system based on land grants. They gave estates to military officers and government officials in exchange for service. This created a class of landed nobility loyal to the crown. It also made governing easier. Instead of managing everything from the capital, the king delegated authority to local lords who handled their own territories. They also loved horses. The Kassites brought horse breeding expertise from their mountain homeland. They established royal stud farms and trained chariot corps. By the 14th century BCE, Babylonian chariots were competitive with anyone's. Horses became status symbols. Owning a good chariot team marked you as elite. The Kassites renamed Babylon's territory. They called it Karduniash, a name that appears in diplomatic correspondence throughout the Late Bronze Age. When the Egyptian pharaoh wrote to the Kassite king, he addressed him as King of Karduniash. When the Hittite king sent ambassadors, they went to Karduniash. The name stuck for the entire Kassite period, then vanished when they did. Diplomacy was actually a Kassite strength. This was the age of international relations, when great powers exchanged elaborate gifts and called each other brother. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt, include numerous messages between Kassite kings and Egyptian pharaohs. The letters discuss marriages, gift exchanges, trade agreements, and complaints about insufficient presents. One letter from Kassite king Burnaburiariash II to Pharaoh Akhenaten is wonderfully petty. The pharaoh had sent gold, but not enough gold, and the Kassite king was not happy. The gold which my brother has sent is not enough. My brother's lack of care is very great. He goes on to point out that his predecessor got more gold, and suggests the pharaoh is being cheap. Ancient diplomatic shade. The Kassites maintained peace with Egypt for generations through strategic marriages and gift diplomacy. They also had to deal with aggressive neighbors. The Assyrians to the north were constantly probing Babylonian borders. The Elamites to the east were traditional enemies who raided whenever opportunity arose. Keeping Babylon secure required constant diplomatic maneuvering and occasional warfare. Militarily, the Kassites were competent but not exceptional. They fought when necessary, usually defensive wars protecting Babylonian territory. They didn't have grand ambitions of empire. They weren't interested in conquering Egypt or subduing Assyria. They just wanted to hold what they had, and maybe push back anyone who got too aggressive. This conservative approach worked surprisingly well. While empires rose and fell around them, Babylon under Kassite rule remained stable. Not spectacular, not dramatically expanding, just stable. In ancient Mesopotamia, stability lasting multiple centuries was its own kind of miracle. The Kassites were prolific builders. They renovated temples, rebuilt city walls, and constructed new administrative buildings. Kurigalzu founded an entirely new city called Dur-Kurigalzu, complete with a massive ziggurat that still stands, partially, in modern Iraq. The ziggurat's core was mud brick, but the Kassites invented a new technique using layers of reeds between brick courses. This made the structure more stable and less prone to cracking, engineering innovation in service of religious architecture. They also produced kuduras, boundary stones that recorded land grants and property transfers. These weren't just administrative documents, they were works of art, carved with divine symbols and protected by elaborate curses against anyone who moved them. Whoever removes this stone or alters its inscription, may the gods curse him, may his descendants perish, may his name be forgotten. Standard Mesopotamian property law. Life under Kassite rule was apparently decent if you weren't at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The economy functioned, trade routes operated, the temples maintained their rituals, scribes continued copying ancient texts and creating new ones. The Epic of Gilgamesh was edited into something close to its final form during the Kassite period. Mathematics and astronomy advanced. Life went on, generation after generation, with remarkable continuity. But nothing lasts forever, even 400-year dynasties. The Kassites' downfall came from the east. The Elamites, their old enemies, invaded around 1155 BCE. They sacked Babylon, carried off the statue of Marduk again, because apparently that was every invader's favorite trophy, and ended Kassite rule. The dynasty that had survived the Bronze Age collapse outlasted multiple Egyptian dynasties and weathered constant Assyrian pressure, finally fell to a determined Elamite assault. 4 centuries of stability ended in fire and plunder, as things tended to end in ancient Mesopotamia. The Kassites disappeared from history almost as mysteriously as they'd arrived. No more Kassite kings, no more Karduniash, barely any trace of their original culture. Just centuries of records showing they'd been there, ruling Babylon with patient competence, while the world changed around them. But Babylon would recover, as it always did. And in the north, Assyria was about to enter a new phase of expansion, bringing laws that would make even the harsh Kassite legal system look gentle by comparison. The Middle Assyrian laws that make Hammurabi look soft. If Hammurabi's code represented justice tempered with some measure of proportionality, The Middle Assyrian laws represented control through terror. These laws, compiled during the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, reveal a society obsessed with maintaining order through brutal punishment and strict social hierarchy. Reading them today feels like watching someone take the concept of harsh justice and push it off a cliff. The laws survived on clay tablets found at Ashur, broken and incomplete, but what remains is enough to paint a vivid picture of Middle Assyrian society. Unlike Hammurabi, who presented his laws as a gift from the gods, the Assyrian laws had no grand preamble, no divine justification, just rules and consequences written down for reference. The treatment of women under Middle Assyrian law was particularly severe. Women's behavior was controlled with an intensity that went beyond anything in earlier Mesopotamian legal codes. Free women had to wear veils in public. This wasn't a religious requirement, it was law. Respectable women covered themselves. Prostitutes and slaves were forbidden from wearing veils. If a slave wore a veil and was caught, her ears would be cut off. The veil laws extended to bizarre specifics. If a man saw an unveiled slave or prostitute and didn't report it, he could be punished. 50 lashes and have his clothes confiscated. The law essentially deputized every man as an enforcer of women's dress codes, social control as a community project. Adultery brought death for both parties if caught, but the husband had options. He could choose to pardon his wife, in which case the other man might also be pardoned, or he could mutilate his wife instead of killing her. Cut off her nose, cut off her ears. The law gave detailed instructions on acceptable mutilations. This wasn't justice. This was ownership expressed through violence. If a woman had a miscarriage, even accidentally, she could be punished. If the miscarriage was caused intentionally by another person, that person would be impaled on stakes, not executed cleanly. Impaled. The law specified that if the woman who miscarried died from the assault, the attacker's wife or daughter would also be killed. Equivalent loss, Assyrian style, which somehow managed to punish people who had nothing to do with the crime. Rape laws were complicated and horrifying. If a man raped an unmarried virgin, he had to marry her and pay a bride price. The woman had no say in this, her rapist became her husband. If the victim was married, the rapist could be executed, but the law also allowed the husband to rape the rapist's wife as compensation. Yes, really, systematic sexual violence as legal remedy. Property crimes brought mutilation. Stealing from the palace or a temple meant death, but other theft might result in cutting off ears, noses, or fingers, depending on the value stolen and the status of the thief. The laws seemed to assume that visible mutilation served as both punishment and warning to others. Walk through an Assyrian city and the missing body parts told stories of legal encounters. The laws regulated professional conduct with typical Assyrian severity. A doctor who caused injury during treatment would have his hands cut off, but only if the patient was a free person. Different rules applied for slaves. A merchant who gave false weight would lose a hand. Builders who constructed defective buildings faced execution if anyone died. Every profession operated under threat of permanent physical consequences for failure. Military service was mandatory and tightly controlled. Men who avoided military duty could be enslaved. Deserters faced death. The laws established Assyria as a militarized state, where service to the army wasn't just expected, it was legally enforced with absolute strictness. This helped explain how Assyria would eventually field the most efficient military machine the ancient world had seen. Social hierarchy permeated every law. Free men, free women, palace dependents, commoners, and slaves all had different legal standings. The same crime brought different punishments depending on who committed it and who the victim was. A free man who struck another free man's wife, causing a miscarriage, faced one punishment. If he struck his own wife, the consequences were different. Status determined everything. Some laws regulated marriage with exhausting detail. How much bride price to pay? What happened if the groom died before the wedding? Rules about dowries, inheritance, divorce. The laws treated marriage as primarily an economic transaction between families. Love wasn't mentioned. Personal choice wasn't a factor. Marriage was property arrangement with sexual rights attached. Inheritance laws favored sons overwhelmingly. Daughters might receive something if there were no sons, but even then male relatives had priority. Widows had some protections, but they remained under male control, transferring from father to husband to sons. Independence wasn't really an option for women in Middle Assyrian society. The laws also covered slaves extensively. Assyria ran on slave labor. captured from conquered territories or born into slavery. Slaves could be bought, sold, inherited, and used however their owners wished. The laws mainly protected owners' property rights rather than slaves' welfare. If someone injured your slave, they paid you compensation. The slave got nothing. One curious aspect was the trial by river ordeal. If evidence was unclear or witnesses contradicted each other, the accused might be thrown into the river. If they survived, they were innocent. If they drowned, guilty. The gods had spoken through water. This practice appeared in earlier Mesopotamian law too, but the Assyrians seemed particularly fond of it. When in doubt, throw someone in the river and see what happens. The Middle Assyrian laws weren't philosophical documents exploring justice. They were practical tools for maintaining order in a militaristic, hierarchical society that valued obedience over equity. The laws assumed people needed fear to behave properly, not fear of divine judgment, fear of immediate, physical, permanent consequences. These laws reflected a society preparing for empire. Assyria was building the administrative and social structures needed to control vast territories. That required discipline, hierarchy, and the willingness to use overwhelming force against disobedience. The laws trained people to accept authority without question and to enforce that authority on each other. Compared to Hammurabi's code, which at least gestured toward proportional justice and protecting the weak, the Middle Assyrian laws felt colder, harsher, more concerned with control than fairness. Hammurabi wanted to be remembered as a just king who cared for his people. The Middle Assyrian lawmakers just wanted obedience, and it worked. The social order these laws enforced would help Assyria survive the Bronze Age collapse and emerge as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Sometimes brutal efficiency triumphs over noble intentions, but the Bronze Age collapse itself was about to reshape the entire ancient world, and even Assyria's harsh laws couldn't protect against the chaos that was coming. The Bronze Age collapse that changed everything. Around 1200 BCE, the ancient world experienced something historians call the Bronze Age collapse. The name makes it sound academic, organized, like a stock market correction. It was nothing like that. It was civilization unraveling across 3 continents over the span of about 50 years. Cities burned, kingdoms vanished, writing disappeared from entire regions. The international system that had connected the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries simply stopped functioning. The collapse didn't announce itself with trumpets. There was no single catastrophic moment. Instead, stress accumulated like cracks in a dam until everything gave way at once. The signs were there for anyone paying attention. Drought, famine, population movements, increased raiding, diplomatic letters growing more desperate. Then the dam broke. The Hittite Empire fell first, or at least most completely. Hattusa, their capital in central Anatolia, was abandoned around 1180 BCE. The city showed signs of destruction and fire, but also signs of deliberate evacuation. People had time to leave, but not enough time to take everything. They just walked away from one of the ancient world's great powers. Hittite vassal states in Syria collapsed in quick succession. Ugarit burned, as we've discussed. Al-Alak was destroyed. Carchemish survived, but as a shadow of its former self. Within a generation, the entire Hittite sphere of influence had vanished. The empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill, that had corresponded with Babylon as an equal, simply ceased to exist. Mycenaean Greece suffered similar devastation. The palace centres at Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos burned. The elaborate bureaucratic systems that had managed these kingdoms disappeared. Linear B writing, used exclusively for palace administration, stopped being used. For 400 years, Greece would have no writing system at all. The Greeks called this period the Dark Ages, and the name fit. Cyprus, the copper island that had supplied bronze to the entire eastern Mediterranean, saw most of its major cities destroyed or abandoned. The copper trade that had enriched the island for centuries collapsed along with the kingdoms that had bought the copper. Egypt survived, barely. Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples around 1175 BCE. But the victory cost Egypt dearly. The economy was devastated. The empire in Syria and Canaan was lost. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a period of decline, internal division, and diminished international influence. The New Kingdom's glory days were over. Trade networks collapsed spectacularly. Bronze required tin and copper, often from different sources hundreds of miles apart. Tin came from Afghanistan or possibly Cornwall. Copper came from Cyprus, Sardinia, or the Sinai. When the trade routes failed, bronze production became difficult or impossible. Kingdoms built on bronze technology suddenly found themselves without the resources that had defined their military and economic power. The palace economies that had managed these trade networks were particularly vulnerable. Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire both used centralized palace systems. The palaces controlled production, distribution, and trade. Thousands of workers depended on palace rations. Merchants operated under palace authority. When the palaces fell, the entire economic system collapsed with them. Why did it happen? Scholars have debated this for decades and will probably continue for decades more. There's no single answer. Multiple stresses converged in an unlucky historical moment. Climate change played a role. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, shows a significant drought across the eastern Mediterranean, starting around 1200 BCE. Crops failed, pasturelands dried up, populations faced food shortages, hungry people migrate, raid or rebel, often all three. Earthquakes hit the region repeatedly during this period. Mycenae shows earthquake damage. Ugarit experienced at least one major quake shortly before its destruction. Troy was damaged by earthquakes multiple times. Seismic activity doesn't destroy civilizations alone, but it adds stress to already strained systems. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, contributed to the chaos. Whether as cause or symptom remains unclear. Were they displaced populations fleeing drought and famine? Opportunistic raiders exploiting existing weakness? A combination? Probably some of each. They moved through a world already breaking down, sometimes destroying. System complexity might have been the ultimate problem. Bronze Age kingdoms were highly interconnected. They depended on long-distance trade, diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and shared technology. This interconnection created wealth and stability during good times. But it also meant failure could cascade. When Hittite Anatolia collapsed, it disrupted trade routes. When trade routes failed, Cyprus suffered. When Cyprus couldn't export copper, bronze production everywhere declined. One falling domino knocked over others. The collapse wasn't uniform. Egypt survived, though weakened. Assyria in northern Mesopotamia continued functioning, though it noticed when Western trade goods stopped arriving. Babylon under Kassite rule kept going. Some Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon adapted and eventually thrived. Greece descended into illiteracy, but people still lived there. The collapse was real, but selective. What emerged afterward was fundamentally different. The palace economies were gone, replaced by more decentralized systems. International trade recovered eventually, but under different arrangements. Iron slowly replaced bronze as the dominant metal for tools and weapons. Iron ore was more widely available than tin, making societies less dependent on long-distance trade for military technology. Alphabetic writing spread during and after the collapse. The Phoenicians developed an alphabet that was simpler than cuneiform or hieroglyphics. It required fewer symbols, less training, and could be learned by merchants and common people rather than just scribal elites. Literacy became more accessible, though it would take centuries for this to fully develop. New peoples filled the power vacuum. The Philistines settled in Canaan, possibly descended from Sea Peoples. The Arameans spread across Syria and eventually became the dominant population in the region. Their language, Aramaic, would eventually become the lingua franca of the Near East. Small kingdoms emerged in the Levant, including Israel and Judah, states that would have been impossible when great empires controlled the region. The Bronze Age collapse killed the old order. The international system of the late Bronze Age, with its great power politics and diplomatic marriages and elaborate gift exchanges, was finished. The world that emerged from the chaos was rougher, more fragmented, but also more dynamic. New peoples had opportunities. Smaller states could survive. Change was possible. Mesopotamia watched this happen from a relatively safe distance. The collapse touched them, but didn't destroy them. The cities survived. The irrigation systems kept functioning. And Assyria, patient as ever, prepared to take advantage of the new world emerging from Bronze Age ruins. They were about to build an empire that would make everything that came before look small and provincial. The Neo-Assyrian Empire and its terrifying army. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, beginning around 900 BCE, didn't just conquer territories, it perfected conquest as a science. For 3 centuries, Assyria built the most efficient, ruthless, and technologically advanced military machine, the ancient world had ever seen. They didn't stumble into empire, they engineered it, refined it, and wielded it with calculated precision. The army was the heart of everything. Not just a tool for defense or occasional campaigns. The army was Assyria's reason for existing. The state organized itself around military expansion. The economy supported the army. The administration served military needs. Even religion emphasized martial gods and divine approval for conquest. Assyria was a military-industrial complex 1500 years before the term existed. What made the Assyrian army so effective? Start with organization. Earlier armies were seasonal affairs. Farmers picked up weapons during campaign season, fought for a few months, then went home for harvest. The Assyrian army was professional and permanent. Soldiers served year-round, received regular pay, trained constantly, and developed actual military expertise instead of just knowing which end of the spear was pointy. The Assyrians organized their army into specialized units: infantry, cavalry, charioteers, archers, siege engineers, sappers. Each unit trained for specific roles. Archers practiced archery, cavalry learned to fight from horseback, siege engineers studied how to knock down walls. This specialization created efficiency. An Assyrian soldier wasn't just a guy with a weapon, he was a trained professional in a specific military discipline. Iron weapons gave Assyria a technological edge. Iron had replaced bronze as the dominant metal for weapons and tools after the Bronze Age collapse. Iron ore was more abundant than the tin needed for bronze. Assyria controlled iron sources in Anatolia and developed superior ironworking techniques. Their weapons were harder, held edges better, and were cheaper to produce in quantity. An army equipped entirely with iron weapons had a significant advantage over anyone still using bronze. But cavalry was perhaps Assyria's greatest innovation. Earlier armies used chariots as their mobile striking force. Chariots were effective but expensive, required flat terrain, and needed specialized horses and skilled drivers. The Assyrians developed true cavalry, soldiers fighting from horseback without chariots. This took generations to perfect. Early cavalry riders had trouble shooting bows while controlling horses. The Assyrians solved this by using pairs of riders, one controlling both horses while the other shot arrows. Eventually, individual riders mastered the skill themselves. Cavalry could go anywhere: mountains, forests, rough terrain that stopped chariots completely. They were faster, more flexible, and could pursue fleeing enemies effectively. Assyrian cavalry became the terror of neighboring kingdoms. Nothing escaped them. Nowhere was safe from their raids. Siege warfare was another Assyrian specialty. Most ancient armies couldn't take fortified cities without starving them out, which took months or years. The Assyrians brought engineering. They built siege towers that rolled up to walls, protecting soldiers as they climbed. They used battering rams with metal caps, suspended from wheeled frames with protective roofs. They dug tunnels under walls to collapse them. They built ramps of earth and rubble to reach wall tops. Assyrian palace reliefs show siege equipment in elaborate detail. Towers bristling with archers, rams with pointed tips smashing through gates, soldiers climbing ladders while defenders pour down arrows and rocks, engineers digging while protected by large shields. The reliefs weren't just art, they were documentation of military technology. Psychological warfare was deliberate Assyrian policy. They wanted enemies to surrender without fighting. The tool for this was terror. Assyrian kings bragged in their inscriptions about atrocities, impaling prisoners on stakes around captured cities, flaying enemy leaders alive and displaying their skins on city walls, creating pyramids of severed heads, burning people alive, deportations of entire populations. This wasn't random cruelty, it was calculated intimidation. The message was clear: resist Assyria and face horrors, submit peacefully, and you might be left alone, maybe even protected. Many cities chose submission. Why fight when you've heard what happened to the last city that resisted? Assyrian brutality was effective propaganda. Deportation became standard policy. When Assyria conquered a region, they often moved entire populations to different parts of the empire, replaced them with people from other conquered territories. This served multiple purposes. Deported people lost their local support networks and were less likely to rebel. Moving populations around mixed different ethnic groups, making unified resistance harder. It also provided labor for royal projects and settled empty lands. Tens of thousands of people were uprooted and marched across the empire. Arameans from Syria ended up in Assyria. Israelites were deported to Mesopotamia after Samaria fell. Babylonians were moved to the west. Deportation on this scale was logistically impressive and humanly devastating. Families lost homes, communities, and connections to ancestral lands. Assyrian efficiency in action. The army's logistics were sophisticated. Assyrian campaigns often involved tens of thousands of soldiers marching hundreds of miles. Feeding them required planning. Supply depots were established along major routes. Conquered territories paid tribute in grain and livestock. The army could requisition supplies from local populations, friendly or not. Engineers built or improved roads to move troops quickly. Assyria created infrastructure for conquest. Intelligence gathering was another strength. Assyrian kings employed scouts and spies throughout the Near East. They knew which kingdoms were weak, which alliances were forming, where rebellions were brewing. Letters in the royal archives show detailed intelligence reports. The king of X is sick, his son is incompetent, the people are unhappy. Now would be a good time to invade. Assyria didn't just react to events, they anticipated them. Command structure was clear and hierarchical. The king commanded overall, but delegated operational control to experienced generals. Provincial governors commanded local forces. Officers led specific units. Orders flowed down the chain. Everyone knew their role. This organizational clarity made the Assyrian army responsive and effective, even in complex campaigns. The army also served political functions. Successful generals gained prestige and power. Military victories legitimized kings. Soldiers loyal to the crown suppressed internal dissent. The army wasn't just for external conquest. It maintained order within the empire, crushed rebellions, and reminded provincial governors that ultimate power resided with the Assyrian king. By 900 BCE, this military machine was fully developed and ready for employment. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was emerging from centuries of relative weakness. New kings with new ambitions were taking power. They had the army, they had the technology, they had the systems. Now they needed the leadership to use all that power effectively. The first great reformer who would revolutionize how to build and maintain an empire was coming. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III, and he was about to change everything. Tiglath-Pileser III revolutionizes how to build an empire. Tiglath-Pileser III seized power in 745 BCE through a coup. The previous king, Ashurbanipal V, was weak. The empire was fragmenting, and provincial governors were acting like independent rulers. Tiglath-Pileser, probably a general or member of the royal family, decided someone competent should be in charge. That someone was him. His name meant, "My trust is in the son of Ashara," referring to the god Nineveh. Some scholars think he was actually named Pulu and took the throne named Tiglath-Pileser to connect himself to an earlier famous king. Either way, the name suggested confidence in divine support for military action. He would need it. The empire he inherited was barely holding together. Provincial governors had become too powerful, keeping tax revenues for themselves and building personal armies. Vassal states paid tribute irregularly or not at all. Rival kingdoms like Urartu in the north were expanding into territories Assyria considered its own. The mighty Assyrian military machine existed, but it wasn't being used effectively. Tiglath-Pileser looked at this situation and decided to rebuild everything. Administrative reform came first. The old system gave provincial governors too much independence. They controlled large territories, commanded local armies, and passed their positions to their sons. This created power bases that could challenge the king. Tiglath-Pileser broke up the large provinces into smaller units. More provinces meant each governor controlled less territory and fewer soldiers. He also ended hereditary governorships. Governors served at the king's pleasure and could be replaced any time. He created a new class of royal officials who reported directly to the king. These officials monitored governors, collected intelligence, and ensured royal commands were followed. The system resembled a spy network crossed with an audit bureau. Nothing happened in the provinces without the king knowing about it. The military reforms were even more dramatic. The traditional Assyrian army relied heavily on provincial troops. Governors provided soldiers from their territories. This made the army's effectiveness dependent on governors' loyalty. Tiglath-Pileser changed this by creating a standing royal army, loyal only to the crown. Professional soldiers, permanently stationed, constantly trained, and paid directly by the central government. This royal army formed the core of Assyrian military power. Provincial levies still existed, but were secondary. The king now commanded a force that didn't depend on potentially unreliable governors. He could deploy this army anywhere, anytime, against external enemies or internal rebels. The reform centralized military power in the king's hands, absolutely. Tiglath-Pileser also revolutionized how Assyria dealt with conquered territories. Previous kings had left defeated kingdoms as vassal states. Local rulers stayed in power, paid tribute, and supposedly remained loyal. This system failed constantly. Vassals rebelled whenever Assyria looked distracted. Then Assyrian armies had to reconquer the same places repeatedly. Tiglath-Pileser introduced a new approach: annexation and provincialization. When he conquered a territory, he didn't leave local rulers in charge. He removed them, deported troublesome populations, installed Assyrian governors, and incorporated the region directly into the empire as a new province. The territory became Assyria, not a subordinate state. This was more expensive to administer but far more stable. Deportation became systematic under his rule. After conquering a region, Tiglath-Pileser deported significant portions of the population to other parts of the empire. He then moved people from elsewhere into the newly conquered territory. This policy broke local power structures and mixed populations so thoroughly that organized resistance became nearly impossible. His inscriptions boast about moving hundreds of thousands of people. The numbers might be exaggerated, but the scale was genuinely massive. His military campaigns were relentless and strategic. He campaigned almost every year, systematically expanding Assyrian control. In the west, he subdued Syria and crushed Damascus after a long siege. He received tribute from kingdoms in the Levant, including Israel and Judah. The Bible mentions him by name, calling him Pul, his alternative name. Kings in Jerusalem paid him tribute to avoid invasion. In the east, he fought against the Medes and other Iranian peoples in the Zagros Mountains. In the north, he battled Urartu, a powerful kingdom centered around Lake Van that had been expanding into territory Assyria wanted. Tiglath-Pileser didn't defeat Urartu completely, but he checked their expansion and secured Assyrian borders. The most significant campaign might have been against Babylon. Babylonia had been independent and occasionally hostile. In 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser invaded, defeated the Babylonian king, and had himself crowned king of Babylon. He didn't appoint a governor or vassal. He personally ruled both Assyria and Babylon simultaneously. This was unprecedented. Babylon had enormous cultural prestige. Previous Assyrian kings who conquered Babylon faced backlash. Tiglath-Pileser presented himself as Babylon's legitimate ruler, participating in New Year festivals and supporting temples. The dual kingship solved a long-standing problem. Babylon couldn't be ignored, couldn't be left independent, but couldn't be treated like a conquered province without causing outrage. By becoming king of Babylon while remaining king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser incorporated Babylonia into his empire while respecting its special status. His administrative innovations created a more efficient tribute system. He catalogued the resources of each province and vassal state. Annual tribute was set at specific amounts. Officials tracked payments carefully. Regions that paid tribute on time were left relatively alone. Regions that didn't pay faced military visits. The system was organized, predictable, and ruthlessly enforced. Tiglath-Pileser also reformed the intelligence network. He received regular reports from across the empire and beyond. Officials informed him about potential rebellions, foreign army movements, harvest failures, and political developments in neighboring kingdoms. This information allowed him to respond quickly to threats and exploit opportunities. Knowledge was power, and Tiglath-Pileser accumulated both. His reign lasted 17 years, from 745 to 727 BCE. In that relatively short time, he transformed Assyria from a fragmenting regional power into a centralized empire that controlled the Near East from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The reforms he implemented would define Assyrian imperial administration for the next century. Later Assyrian kings built on his foundations. They could focus on expansion and consolidation, because Tiglath-Pileser had solved the fundamental problems of imperial governance: how to prevent provincial governors from becoming too powerful, how to maintain a loyal army, how to keep conquered territories under control, how to manage Babylon. He answered all these questions with reforms that worked. When Tiglath-Pileser III died in 727 BCE, he left an empire that was larger, stronger, and more efficiently organized than anything Assyria had achieved before. His successors inherited a machine designed for conquest and control. One of those successors would take that machine and build himself an entirely new capital city, creating one of the most impressive urban centers the ancient world would ever see. His name was Sargon II, and he had big plans. Sargon II and his brand new capital city. Sargon II came to power in 721 BCE under circumstances that were, let's say, unclear. His name meant the king is legitimate, which is exactly what someone with a questionable claim to the throne would call himself. He claimed to be the son of Tiglath-Pileser III, but the evidence is ambiguous. He might have been a younger son, a usurper, or someone from a collateral branch of the royal family. Either way, he took the throne and spent his reign proving he deserved it. The name Sargon was itself a statement. It deliberately echoed Sargon of Akkad, the legendary empire builder from 1500 years earlier. By choosing this name, Sargon II positioned himself as heir to ancient imperial tradition. He was saying, without saying it directly, that he would build an empire worthy of the name. His first years as king were spent dealing with immediate crises. Rebellions had erupted across the empire when the previous king died. Vassal states saw a succession as an opportunity to stop paying tribute. Sargon spent his early reign reconquering territories that had theoretically already been conquered. This was standard procedure for Neo-Assyrian kings. Prove you could hold power by crushing everyone who doubted it. The most serious challenge came from Babylon. The Chaldeans, a tribal group in southern Mesopotamia, had seized control under a leader named Marduk-apla-iddini II. The Bible calls him Merodach-Baladan. He allied with Elam to the east and resisted Assyrian control for years. Sargon fought multiple campaigns against him, eventually driving him out, but Marduk-apla-iddini kept returning. Babylon remained a persistent problem throughout Sargon's reign. In the west, Sargon dealt with a rebellion in Syria and the Levant. Several kingdoms had formed an alliance to resist Assyrian tribute demands. The rebellion centered on Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. Sargon besieged the city, captured it in 720 BCE, and deported much of the population. The Bible records this as the fall of the northern kingdom and the disappearance of the 10 tribes of Israel. Sargon's inscriptions confirm it. He boasted about deporting 27,290 people from Samaria and surrounding territories. Specific numbers. The Assyrians kept excellent records of human displacement. To the north, Sargon fought Urartu, the persistent rival kingdom around Lake Van. In 714 BCE, he launched a massive campaign, penetrated deep into Urartian territory, and defeated their king Rusa I in battle. Urartu survived but was severely weakened. They would never again seriously challenge Assyria. In the east, Sargon campaigned against the Medes and other Iranian peoples. He established Assyrian control over the Zagros mountain passes, securing trade routes and creating buffer zones against potential eastern threats. His campaigns were methodical, year after year, systematically expanding or securing Assyrian borders in every direction. But military campaigns, however successful, weren't Sargon's most lasting achievement. That honor goes to Dusharakon, his brand new capital city. The name meant Fortress of Sargon. Subtle, it was not. Building an entirely new capital was an enormous undertaking. Previous Assyrian kings had ruled from traditional cities, primarily Ashur and Nineveh. These cities had history, established temples, existing infrastructure. Sargon decided to start from scratch. He chose a site near modern Khorsabad in northern Iraq, about 15 kilometers northeast of Nineveh. Construction began around 717 BCE. Sargon mobilized resources from across the empire. Workers, materials, craftsmen, artisans, all converged on the construction site. Deportees from conquered territories provided much of the labor. The inscriptions mention people from Phoenicia, Syria, Anatolia, and Babylon working on the city. Forced labor on an imperial scale. The city was designed on a grand scale, nearly square, with walls stretching about 1.7 kilometers per side. 7 gates, each named after a god, pierced the walls. The fortifications were massive, built to impress as much as defend. This was a capital meant to communicate power, wealth, and permanence. The royal palace dominated the city. Built on a raised platform, it covered roughly 10 hectares, not just a residence. An administrative center, throne room complex, temple area, and architectural statement all in one. The palace contained over 200 rooms and courtyards arranged around 30 interior courts. The scale was deliberately overwhelming. The walls of the palace were decorated with stone reliefs, showing Sargon's military victories, hunting expeditions, and religious ceremonies. These weren't just decorations, they were propaganda carved in stone. Visitors walking through the palace corridors saw endless images of Assyrian might, conquered enemies, tribute bearers, the king receiving divine favor. The message was clear and constantly reinforced. Assyria was powerful, resistance was futile, submission was inevitable. Sargon imported exotic materials from across the empire and beyond. Cedar from Lebanon for the roof beams, stone from quarries in the Zagros Mountains, precious metals and stones from tribute and trade. The palace was meant to showcase the wealth generated by conquest. Look what empire can build, look what submission to Assyria provides. The city also included temples to major gods, administrative buildings, arsenals, and residential quarters for officials, soldiers, and craftsmen. This was a planned city, designed as a coherent whole rather than grown organically over centuries. Everything had its place. Everything served the imperial project. But there was something slightly desperate about Duru-Sharrukin. Sargon was building a capital that would make his reign unmistakable, permanent, carved into the landscape. He wanted a city that would outlast him, that would force future generations to remember his name and achievements. He was building a legacy. The city was nearly complete when Sargon died in 705 BCE. He died in battle fighting in Anatolia. Worse, his body wasn't recovered. For an Assyrian king, dying in battle without proper burial was ominous. It suggested the gods had abandoned him. His son Sennacherib, who succeeded him, apparently thought so too. Sennacherib abandoned Duru-Sharrukin almost immediately. He moved the capital back to Nineveh and focused his building projects there. Sargon's magnificent new city, barely finished, was left behind. It wasn't completely abandoned. Some administrative functions continued, but as a royal capital, Duru-Sharrukin lasted less than a decade. The city Sargon built to immortalize his name became a monument to imperial ambition and the fragility of legacy. French archaeologists excavated Duru-Sharrukin in the 19th century. They found it remarkably well preserved, precisely because it had been abandoned so quickly. The palace reliefs, the inscriptions, the planned layout, all survived. Sargon's city stands today as a snapshot of Assyrian imperial ideology frozen in stone and mud brick. Sennacherib inherited his father's empire and his father's ambitions, but he had his own ideas about where power should reside. Nineveh was about to become something the ancient world had never seen before. Sennacherib makes Nineveh the wonder of the world. Sennacherib became king in 705 BCE and immediately faced a choice: continue his father's project at Duru-Sharrukin, or choose his own path. He chose his own path. Nineveh would be his capital, and he would make it the greatest city in the world. Not through conquest alone, though there would be plenty of that. Through urban planning, engineering, and architectural ambition that bordered on obsession. Nineveh wasn't new. It had been occupied for thousands of years, a major Assyrian city long before Sennacherib. But it wasn't particularly impressive compared to Babylon or even some smaller cities. Sennacherib looked at Nineveh and saw potential. He saw what it could become with unlimited resources and royal determination. He started with the basics: water. Cities in Mesopotamia lived or died by their water supply. Nineveh sat on the Tigris River, which helped, but the river alone wasn't enough for Sennacherib's plans. He wanted gardens, parks, orchards within the city. He wanted greenery in a landscape that was naturally brown. This required engineering on a scale that made previous kings look unambitious. Sennacherib built a system of canals bringing water from mountains 50 kilometers away. Not simple irrigation ditches, sophisticated aqueducts with precisely calculated gradients. The most famous was at Jerwan, where he constructed a stone aqueduct bridge over 280 meters long with corbelled arches. Water flowed across the valley in a raised channel. This was 700 years before Roman aqueducts, and while not as elaborate as what Rome would build, it was still remarkably advanced for its time. The inscriptions describe his water projects with pride. He dug 18 canals, he built dams, he created reservoirs, he changed the course of rivers, all to bring water to Nineveh so he could build the gardens he envisioned. The city became green in a region where green was expensive and difficult. The palace Sennacherib built was enormous, even by Assyrian standards. He called it the palace without rival, which tells you about his confidence level. The palace covered approximately 200 acres, 70 rooms on the ground floor alone, and there were upper floors that haven't survived. The throne room could hold hundreds of people. Every surface that could be decorated was decorated. Stone reliefs covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Unlike earlier Assyrian palace art that was carved in outline, Sennacherib's sculptors developed a technique showing depth, perspective, and realistic details. The reliefs depicted military campaigns with geographic specificity. You could identify which city was being besieged by the landscape features shown in the background. Mountains meant campaigns in the north. Marshes indicated southern Babylonia. Palm trees suggested the Levant. One famous relief series shows the siege of Lachish, a fortified city in Judah that Sennacherib captured in 701 BCE. The reliefs show every stage of the siege: Assyrian army approaching, siege ramps being built, battering rams attacking walls, defenders throwing down torches to burn the siege equipment, captives being led away, the king sitting on his throne receiving prisoners. The detail is extraordinary. Archaeologists excavating Lachish found that the relief accurately depicted the actual siege ramp they uncovered. The palace also featured massive stone sculptures of human-headed winged bulls, called lamassu, guarding doorways. These creatures had 5 legs, a curious detail. Viewed from the front, they appeared to be standing still. Viewed from the side, they appeared to be walking. Ancient optical illusion built into monumental sculpture. Each lamassu weighed approximately 40 tons. Moving them from quarries, transporting them to the palace, and positioning them required engineering expertise and enormous labor forces. Sennacherib's inscriptions are detailed about construction. He mentions importing timber from Lebanon, Cilicia, and mountains to the north. He brought copper, bronze, iron, and precious stones from across the empire. He employed craftsmen from every conquered territory: Phoenician carpenters, Syrian metalworkers, Babylonian artists. The palace was built by the empire, literally. Every region contributed materials or expertise. The gardens Sennacherib created were famous. His inscriptions describe planting trees and plants from every part of his empire and beyond. Cotton from India, vines from Greece, trees from mountains, exotic plants he'd seen during campaigns. He built raised gardens, terraced structures, planted areas throughout the city. He created artificial hills and planted them with trees. Nineveh became a garden city, green and flowering in a landscape where such abundance was unnatural. Some scholars think these gardens were the actual hanging gardens, attributed to Babylon. The timing and descriptions fit Sennacherib's Nineveh better than anything known from Babylon. Ancient writers might have confused the cities, or Babylon's reputation overshadowed Nineveh's achievements. Either way, Sennacherib created something remarkable. Gardens sustained by complex hydraulic systems, green terraces rising above the city, a manufactured paradise. But Sennacherib wasn't just building, he was conquering. His military campaigns were numerous and often brutal. He fought in the mountains to the north, in Cilicia, throughout the Levant. His most famous campaign targeted Judah in 701 BCE. He besieged Jerusalem, but ultimately accepted tribute from King Hezekiah instead of destroying the city. The Bible and Assyrian records both mention this campaign, though with different emphasis. His relationship with Babylon was complicated and ultimately disastrous. Babylon rebelled repeatedly during his reign. Sennacherib tried various approaches. He installed a pro-Assyrian king. That didn't work. He installed his own son as king. That didn't work either. His son was captured by Babylonian rebels and probably killed. In 689 BCE, Sennacherib finally lost patience. He besieged Babylon, captured it, and destroyed it. Not just conquered, destroyed. He tore down the city walls, demolished temples, diverted water to flood the ruins. He wanted to erase Babylon. This was shocking even by Assyrian standards. Babylon had enormous cultural and religious significance. Destroying it was sacrilege to many Mesopotamians, including many Assyrians. Sennacherib's inscriptions justify the destruction with religious language. Babylon's gods had abandoned the city because of its wickedness. The destruction was divine judgment, not royal cruelty. Whether Sennacherib believed this or was just managing public relations is unknowable. The fact that he felt he needed to justify it suggests he knew the action was controversial. He ruled for 24 years, transforming Nineveh into a city that amazed visitors and intimidated enemies. The gardens, the water systems, the palace, the sculptures, everything was designed to communicate power, wealth, and permanence. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib was assassinated. His own sons killed him while he was praying in a temple. The sources are unclear about which sons or exactly why, though destroying Babylon probably contributed to his unpopularity. The king who made Nineveh a wonder of the world died violently in a religious sanctuary. His son Esarhaddon, who apparently wasn't involved in the assassination, succeeded him. Esarhaddon inherited a magnificent capital and a challenging empire. He also inherited his father's complicated relationship with Babylon and would try to fix it. But first, he had an even more ambitious project in mind: Egypt. Esarhaddon conquers Egypt. Because why not? Esarhaddon became king under difficult circumstances in 681 BCE. His father had just been murdered by his own brothers. Civil war immediately erupted as those brothers tried to seize the throne. Esarhaddon was apparently his father's chosen successor, but chosen successors still had to fight for power in ancient Assyria. He defeated his brothers in 6 weeks of fighting and took control of the empire. It was not an ideal start to a reign. His first major decision was reversing his father's most controversial policy. Sennacherib had destroyed Babylon. Esarhaddon decided to rebuild it, not out of sentimentality. This was practical politics. Babylon's destruction had outraged much of Mesopotamia. The city had religious significance that transcended politics. Destroying it had been a propaganda disaster. Rebuilding it would demonstrate that the new king was different from his father, wiser, more respectful of tradition. Esarhaddon launched a massive reconstruction project. He restored temples, particularly the Esargala temple of Marduk. He repaired city walls. He brought back the statue of Marduk that his father had carried off. He presented himself as Babylon's liberator rather than its conqueror. The reconstruction took years and consumed enormous resources, but it achieved its political goal. Babylon became peaceful, or at least less rebellious, under Esarhaddon's rule. But rebuilding Babylon wasn't enough to occupy an ambitious Assyrian king. Esarhaddon looked around for new territories to conquer. The empire already controlled Mesopotamia, most of Syria, and significant portions of Anatolia. The obvious remaining target was Egypt, the richest kingdom in the region, the one major power that had never been fully conquered by Assyria, the ultimate prize. Egypt in the 7th century BCE was divided. The 25th dynasty, consisting of Nubian pharaohs from the kingdom of Kush, ruled Egypt. But their control was contested by local Egyptian rulers, particularly in the Nile Delta. The pharaoh at this time was Taharqa, ruling from Memphis. He was powerful but dealing with internal Egyptian politics and revolts. Egypt was strong but not unified. Esarhaddon saw an opportunity. The first campaign in 674 BCE was a disaster. Esarhaddon marched through the Levant, crossed the Sinai Desert, and invaded Egypt. Taharqa met the Assyrian army and defeated it decisively. Esarhaddon retreated back to Assyria with heavy losses. For an Assyrian king who based legitimacy on military success, this was embarrassing. The inscriptions barely mention this defeat, focusing instead on his other campaigns. Losing wasn't on brand. Esarhaddon learned from failure. He spent the next few years preparing. He secured his logistics, improved supply lines through the desert, gathered intelligence about Egypt's defenses, and built alliances with local rulers in the Levant who could provide support. He also worked on his health, which was apparently poor. Ancient texts mention that he suffered from a chronic illness, possibly a skin condition, or something more serious. He consulted doctors, priests, and diviners, trying to understand if the gods supported his Egyptian plans. In 671 BCE, he tried again. This time the campaign was methodical and overwhelming. The Assyrian army crossed the Sinai with better preparation. They brought sufficient supplies. They had siege equipment ready. They had learned about Egyptian military tactics from the previous encounter. Esarhaddon didn't just invade, he systematically conquered. The Assyrians took Memphis, Egypt's capital, after a siege. Taharqa fled south to Thebes. Esarhaddon proclaimed himself pharaoh of Egypt and king of Kush. His inscriptions describe the victory with typical Assyrian detail. He lists the cities captured, the amount of plunder taken, the prisoners deported. Gold, silver, precious stones, exotic animals, everything valuable was sent back to Assyria. Egypt's wealth became Assyria's wealth. But conquering Egypt was easier than holding it. The distance from Nineveh to Memphis was approximately 2,000 kilometers. Communication took weeks. Moving armies took months. Egypt was geographically isolated. protected by deserts and sea. Controlling it from Mesopotamia was logistically challenging in a way that controlling Syria or Babylonia wasn't. Esarhaddon tried to solve this through local administration. He left Egyptian rulers in place as vassals, requiring tribute and loyalty, but allowing them to govern locally. He installed Assyrian advisors and garrison troops, but didn't try to impose direct provincial administration like he did in closer territories. This was pragmatic but left Egypt vulnerable to rebellion. Taharqa didn't accept defeat. He remained in southern Egypt, ruling from Thebes, waiting for opportunities. As soon as Esarhaddon returned to Assyria, Egyptian revolts began. Local rulers stopped sending tribute. They communicated with Taharqa. They prepared to throw off Assyrian control. The conquest looked increasingly temporary. In 669 BCE, Esarhaddon decided to return to Egypt and reassert control. He mobilized the army and began the long march west. He never made it. Somewhere in northern Syria, he became seriously ill. His health, never good, finally failed completely. He died in 669 BCE, still trying to reach Egypt. Esarhaddon had reigned for 12 years. He'd rebuilt Babylon, conquered Egypt, managed the vast Assyrian Empire, and dealt with constant rebellions. His health problems make his accomplishments more impressive. Ancient texts describe him consulting with priests about his illnesses, seeking divine healing, asking if the gods were punishing him. He ruled while suffering, which couldn't have been easy. He'd also planned his succession carefully, trying to avoid the disaster that had marked his own accession. He designated his son Ashurbanipal as heir to the Assyrian throne, and another son, Shamash-shum-ukin, as king of Babylon. This division was meant to solve the perpetual Babylon problem, give Babylon its own king, technically subordinate to Assyria but with local authority. It seemed clever at the time. Esarhaddon's Egyptian conquest was his most famous achievement, even though it wouldn't last. Within a few years of his death, the Egyptians would expel Assyrian forces and reassert independence under the 26th dynasty. The conquest was temporary, but for a brief moment, Assyria controlled Egypt. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Nile. Every major center of ancient Near Eastern civilization acknowledged Assyrian supremacy. It was the high point of Assyrian power. The empire would never be larger, and the king who inherited this vast domain would be remembered not primarily for military conquests, though there were plenty, but for something completely different, a library, the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. Ashurbanipal was about to become history's most literate conqueror. Ashurbanipal and the world's first library. Ashurbanipal became king in 669 BCE, when his father died on the way to reconquer Egypt. He inherited the largest empire the Near East had ever seen, and immediately had to prove he could hold it. Egypt was in revolt. Babylon was restless. Various vassal states were testing the new king to see if he was as ruthless as his predecessors. The usual Assyrian succession problems, just on a massive scale. Ashurbanipal dealt with Egypt first. He marched west, invaded, and reconquered Memphis in 667 BCE. Taharqa, the persistent Nubian pharaoh, fled south again. The Assyrian army pursued deeper into Egypt than they'd ever gone before, reaching Thebes in 663 BCE. They sacked Thebes, the ancient capital of Upper Egypt. The city that had stood for nearly 2,000 years, filled with temples and monuments, was plundered systematically. The wealth taken was staggering. Obelisks, statues, gold, silver, precious materials accumulated over centuries of Egyptian civilization, all shipped back to Assyria. The sack of Thebes was so thorough, it became legendary. The Bible mentions it. Greek historians wrote about it. The city never fully recovered its former glory. This was Assyrian efficiency at its peak. Complete conquest, systematic plunder, and devastation that would be remembered for centuries. But Egypt remained difficult to hold. Distance, logistics, and Egyptian resistance eventually proved too much. By 653 BCE, Egypt had regained independence under Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty. Ashurbanipal was dealing with problems closer to home, and couldn't spare the resources to keep reconquering Egypt. The Egyptian adventure, his father's great achievement, lasted less than 20 years. The problem closer to home was Babylon, specifically his brother Shamash-shum-ukin. Their father had made Shamash-shum-ukin king of Babylon while Ashurbanipal ruled Assyria. This was supposed to solve the Babylon problem by giving Babylonians their own king from the Assyrian royal family. Instead, it created a civil war. Shamash-shum-ukin apparently grew tired of being subordinate to his brother. He formed a coalition with Elam, with Arab tribes, with Chaldean leaders in southern Babylonia. In 652 BCE, he rebelled openly. This wasn't just a vassal revolt, this was fratricide on an imperial scale. The war lasted 4 years. Ashurbanipal besieged Babylon. The city held out, supplied by allies and determined to resist. Famine eventually decided the outcome. The siege lasted so long that people inside Babylon resorted to eating anything available. Ancient sources describe cannibalism in the starving city. In 648 BCE, Babylon fell. Shamash-shum-ukin died in the flames as the palace burned. Whether he killed himself or died fighting is unclear. Ashurbanipal's treatment of Babylon was brutal, but not as destructive as Sennacherib's had been. He executed rebel leaders, deported populations, and installed loyal administrators, but he didn't destroy the city. He'd learned from his grandfather's mistake. Babylon could be conquered, but shouldn't be obliterated. Cultural sensitivity through calculated violence. The war continued beyond Babylon. Ashurbanipal launched campaigns against Elam, which had supported his brother's rebellion. Between 647 and 640 BCE, he systematically destroyed the Elamite kingdom. He captured Susa, their capital, and looted it thoroughly. He destroyed temples, desecrated royal tombs, and carried off the statue of the Elamite goddess. Elam ceased to exist as an independent power. This was vengeance on a civilizational scale. Despite all this military activity, or perhaps because of it, Ashurbanipal is most famous today for something completely different: his library. In his palace at Nineveh, Ashurbanipal created the most comprehensive collection of cuneiform texts the ancient world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, carefully organized, catalogued, and preserved. This wasn't accidental. Ashurbanipal was genuinely interested in learning. His inscriptions boast about his education. He could read Sumerian and Akkadian. He understood mathematics and astronomy. He'd studied divination. He claimed to be the wisest king who'd ever ruled, which was typical royal bragging, but in his case partially justified. He actually read the texts in his library. He sent scribes throughout Mesopotamia to collect tablets. Every major temple, every city archive, every private collection that held interesting texts received visits from Ashurbanipal's agents. They copied tablets, or sometimes just took the originals. Royal acquisition policy was straightforward. The king wanted texts. The king got texts. The library contained everything. Literary texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh in its most complete version, religious texts, prayers, hymns, ritual instructions, scientific texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, historical texts, king lists, chronicles, omen texts, thousands of them, recording observations and predictions, administrative documents, letters, treaties, legal texts. If it was written in cuneiform, Ashurbanipal wanted a copy. The tablets were organized systematically. Series were kept together. Colophons at the end of tablets identified which library they belonged to, which series they were part of, and often included curses against anyone who stole them. He who removes this tablet, may Ashur and Ninlil, angered and grim, cast him down, erase his name and his seed from the land. Standard ancient copyright protection through divine threat. The library wasn't public. This was a royal collection for the king's use, and for educated members of the court. But its existence meant that texts were preserved that would otherwise have been lost. When Nineveh fell, the library's tablets were buried in the destruction. They survived in the ruins for 2,500 years until archaeologists excavated the site in the 19th century. Those excavations recovered approximately 30,000 tablets from Ashurbanipal's library. Much of what we know about Mesopotamian literature, religion, science, and history comes from this collection. The library preserved knowledge across millennia. Ashurbanipal wanted to be remembered as the greatest warrior king. Instead, he's remembered as the king who saved Mesopotamian civilization's written heritage. His military achievements were genuine. He conquered Egypt, crushed his brother's rebellion, destroyed Elam, fought successful campaigns in Arabia and Anatolia. The empire reached its maximum extent under his rule. But the empire was straining. Holding territories from Egypt to the Persian Gulf required constant military action. Resources were stretched. Subject peoples grew increasingly resentful. Ashurbanipal's later years are obscure. The historical record becomes unclear after around 630 BCE. He probably died around 627 BCE, but the exact date and circumstances are unknown. His death marked a turning point. The empire he left behind was vast but exhausted. The military machine that had conquered so much needed constant fuel, and the empire was running out. What came next happened with shocking speed. The greatest empire the ancient Near East had ever seen would collapse within 20 years of Ashurbanipal's death. Destroyed so thoroughly that Nineveh would become a ruin, and Assyria would vanish from history. But from those ashes, one final Mesopotamian empire would rise. The Neo-Babylonian Empire rises from Assyria's ashes. Ashes. The Assyrian Empire collapsed with a speed that shocked the ancient world. An empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries, that had conquered Egypt, that had destroyed Elam, simply disintegrated. Between 627 and 609 BCE, Assyria went from superpower to historical footnote. The cities burned, the armies vanished, the administration that had controlled millions of people ceased to function. The details are frustratingly unclear. The historical record becomes fragmentary during Assyria's final years. We know Ashurbanipal's successors were weak. We know internal conflicts erupted. We know the empire faced simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. But the exact sequence of events, who did what when, remains partially mysterious. The Medoms from Iran attacked from the east. These were Iranian peoples who'd been consolidating into a kingdom in the Zagros Mountains and beyond. They'd been Assyrian subjects or enemies for generations. Now they saw opportunity. The Babylonians rebelled from the south, and the Scythians, nomadic warriors from the steppes, raided from the north. Assyria faced enemies on every frontier while dealing with succession crises and internal rebellions. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. The Medes and Babylonians besieged it together, and the great capital that Sennacherib had made into a wonder of the world was destroyed, burned so thoroughly that it would remain buried for over 2,000 years. Ashur fell the same year. The Assyrian heartland was devastated. The empire was finished. The prophet Nahum, writing around this time, expressed what many subject peoples felt. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The fall of Nineveh was celebrated throughout the Near East. The empire that had ruled through terror was destroyed, and its former subjects were not sad about it. But the collapse of one empire created opportunities for others. Babylon, which had been conquered, destroyed, rebuilt, and conquered again multiple times, was about to have its final moment of glory. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, also called the Chaldean Empire, would be the last independent Mesopotamian empire, the last time Babylon would rule anything, and they made it count. The architect of Babylonian independence was Nabopolassar. He was a Chaldean, from the tribal groups in southern Mesopotamia that had resisted Assyrian control for generations. Around 626 BCE, while Assyria was distracted by other problems, Nabopolassar declared himself king of Babylon. He spent years fighting Assyrian forces, gradually consolidating control over southern Mesopotamia. His alliance with the Medes was crucial. The Median king Sennacherib had his own reasons for wanting Assyria destroyed. Together, Babylonians and Medes had the strength to defeat Assyrian armies and besiege Assyrian cities. They carved up the Assyrian Empire between them. The Medes took the northern and eastern territories. The Babylonians took the south and west, including Syria and the Levant. But Nabopolassar was aging. The task of building a real empire from Assyria's ruins fell to his son. That son was named Nebuchadnezzar. You've probably heard of him. Nebuchadnezzar II became king in 605 BCE, when his father died. He'd already been leading military campaigns, so the transition was smooth. His first major challenge came from Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho II had taken advantage of Assyria's collapse to expand into Syria. Egypt and Babylon both wanted control of the Levant and its profitable trade routes. Conflict was inevitable. The decisive battle happened at Carchemish in 605 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar commanded the Babylonian army. The details are sparse, but the outcome was clear. Babylon won decisively. Egyptian forces were routed. Necho retreated back to Egypt, and Babylon established control over Syria, Phoenicia, and the Levant. The victory announced that Babylon was the new dominant power in the Near East. Nebuchadnezzar spent much of his 43-year reign campaigning. He fought in the Levant repeatedly, dealing with rebellions and Egyptian intrigues. Small kingdoms in the region had to choose between Babylonian and Egyptian overlordship. Many chose badly and paid for it. The most famous campaign targeted Jerusalem. the kingdom of Judah, caught between Babylon and Egypt, had rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem in 597 BCE and forced its surrender. He deported the king and much of Jerusalem's elite to Babylon. He installed a puppet king and demanded loyalty. It didn't last. Jerusalem rebelled again. Nebuchadnezzar returned in 589 BCE and besieged the city for 18 months. In 587 BCE, Jerusalem fell. This time Nebuchadnezzar showed no mercy. He destroyed the Temple of Solomon, a center of Jewish religious life. He demolished Jerusalem's walls. He deported much of the remaining population to Babylon. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist as an independent state. The Babylonian exile, as it became known in Jewish tradition, lasted decades. Thousands of Judeans lived in Babylon, maintaining their identity and religion in a foreign land. They couldn't return until the Persian conquest generations later. The exile profoundly shaped Jewish religion and identity. Much of the Hebrew Bible was edited or written during this period, preserving traditions and explaining catastrophe through theological frameworks. Nebuchadnezzar also campaigned against Tyre, the wealthy Phoenician island city. He besieged it for 13 years, from 585 to 572 BCE. 13 years. The siege eventually ended with some kind of negotiated settlement. Tyre maintained limited independence, but acknowledged Babylonian supremacy and paid tribute. Even for Babylon, conquering an island fortress protected by Phoenician naval power was difficult. But Nebuchadnezzar's empire was fundamentally different from Assyria's. Babylon didn't have the same military culture, the same systematic brutality, the same emphasis on constant conquest. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was smaller than Assyria's peak extent. It focused on Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Levant. It didn't try to hold Egypt or conquer deep into Anatolia or Iran. This more limited scope made the empire more manageable. Babylon could actually govern what it controlled, rather than constantly reconquering rebellious provinces. The administration was effective, the economy prospered, and Babylon itself became the wealthiest and most magnificent city in the world. Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror, yes, but he was primarily a builder. His construction projects in Babylon were extraordinary. He didn't just restore the city, he transformed it into something unprecedented. A city so impressive that it became legendary, that stories about it would be told for thousands of years. He built walls, he built temples, he built palaces, he built gates decorated with glazed bricks, showing dragons and bulls, and he built gardens that became one of the most famous legends in human history. Gardens that may or may not have actually existed the way the stories claimed. But if any king could build impossible gardens, it was Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar II and his hanging gardens. Nebuchadnezzar II looked at Babylon and decided it needed to be perfect. Not just impressive, perfect. The greatest city in human history. A capital worthy of an empire, worthy of the gods, worthy of his ambitions. He had 43 years on the throne and unlimited resources from tribute and conquest. He used every bit of it. The city he inherited was already significant. But Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon on a scale that made previous versions look like rough drafts. The city eventually covered approximately 900 hectares, with massive double walls surrounding it. The outer walls stretched roughly 18 kilometers around the city, not a simple barrier. A fortification system so elaborate that ancient writers struggle to describe it adequately. The inner wall was supposedly thick enough that chariot races could be run on top. Multiple sources mention this detail, though whether anyone actually raced chariots on the wall is questionable. The point was the sheer scale. Walls wide enough to drive chariots on sent a message about Babylon's power and wealth. We have walls so massive we can waste the top surface on chariot tracks. 8 gates pierced the walls, each dedicated to a god. The most famous was the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of love and war. The gate was decorated with glazed blue bricks, featuring reliefs of dragons, bulls, and lions in yellow and brown. The colors were vivid, almost overwhelming. Walking through the Ishtar Gate meant passing between ranks of mythological creatures rendered in bright, permanent ceramic, intimidation through interior decoration. The gate opened onto the processional way, a broad avenue running through the city center. The street was paved with limestone slabs and lined with walls decorated with more glazed brick reliefs. Lions, symbols of Ishtar, lined the route. During religious festivals, processions carrying divine statues would travel this route from the temples to the Akitu house outside the city. Thousands of people would watch, the religious theatre of an empire. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the Ziggurat of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, called Eteminanki, Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. This was possibly the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel story. The ziggurat rose approximately 90 meters high, built in 7 stages with a temple at the top. Climbing to the summit required ascending multiple staircases. The view from the top would have shown the entire city spreading in every direction, a carefully planned urban landscape centered on divine worship. The Esagila temple complex next to the ziggurat was Marduk's main temple. Nebuchadnezzar lavished wealth on it, gold, silver, precious stones decorating every surface. The statue of Marduk was covered in gold. The temple treasury held the accumulated wealth of centuries. During the New Year festival, the king would enter this temple, be ritually humiliated by priests who struck him and pulled his ears, then reinstated after swearing to serve the gods faithfully. Even absolute monarchs needed divine approval renewed annually. Nebuchadnezzar built palaces, multiple palaces, actually. The southern palace was his main residence, covering several acres with hundreds of rooms, throne rooms, administrative offices, private quarters, storage facilities, all elaborately decorated. The northern palace was possibly built later, perhaps for the crown prince, or as a royal retreat. More palaces meant more space for the royal family, officials and servants. Running an empire required infrastructure. But the structure Nebuchadnezzar is most famous for is one we're not entirely sure existed: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, legendary terraced gardens rising high above the city, filled with trees and flowers, watered by mechanical systems raising water from the Euphrates. Beautiful, impossible, and possibly fictional. Ancient writers described them in detail. Strabo claimed they rose in a series of terraces, one above another, supported on cube-shaped pillars. Plants grew at every level, creating the appearance of a mountain covered in vegetation. Irrigation channels ran throughout, and mechanisms lifted water to the highest levels. Diodorus Siculus said the gardens were built by a Syrian king for his Persian wife, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. Later writers attributed them to Nebuchadnezzar for similar reasons. The problem is that Babylonian sources don't mention them. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions list his construction projects obsessively: walls, gates, temples, palaces, processional ways, everything he built. But no hanging gardens. Herodotus, who visited Babylon less than a century after Nebuchadnezzar's death, described the city in detail. No mention of gardens. Several explanations exist. Maybe the gardens did exist but weren't considered remarkable enough to record in royal inscriptions. Maybe they were part of a palace complex and didn't need separate mention. Maybe ancient writers confused Babylon with Nineveh, where Sennacherib definitely built elaborate gardens with sophisticated irrigation systems. Maybe the gardens existed but were built by someone else, and attributed to Nebuchadnezzar later. Or maybe classical writers invented impressive gardens to match Babylon's legendary reputation. Archaeologists haven't found definitive evidence. Parts of Babylon remain unexcavated. The water table has risen since ancient times, making some areas difficult to dig. Ancient structures were robbed for building materials over centuries. The gardens could have existed and left no surviving trace. Or they never existed at all, except in imagination. What definitely existed was Nebuchadnezzar's obsession with building. His inscriptions are repetitive, listing construction projects, materials used, dedications to gods. He rebuilt temples throughout Mesopotamia, not just in Babylon. He repaired canals and irrigation systems. He built fortifications. He created new neighborhoods. He turned Babylon into a carefully planned city rather than the organic growth pattern typical of ancient urbanism. The city's population possibly reached 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The streets were laid out in a rough grid pattern. Residential neighborhoods were organized. Markets functioned. The city was wealthy, crowded, cosmopolitan. People from across the empire lived there, brought by deportation, trade, or opportunity. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years, dying in 562 BCE. He'd built an empire and rebuilt a city. He'd defeated Egypt, conquered Jerusalem, besieged Tyre for 13 years, and established Babylon as the unquestioned power in the Near East. His construction projects transformed Babylon into something approaching the legendary city described by later writers. But empires built by one man rarely survive succession problems. Nebuchadnezzar's death began Babylon's decline. His successors were weak. The empire he'd built would last less than 30 years after his death. A new power was rising in the east, and Babylon's final glory was about to meet Persian ambition. The last independent Mesopotamian empire was running out of time. The Persian conquest that ended it all. After Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BCE, Babylon's stability died with him. His son Amel-Marduk ruled for only 2 years before being assassinated. His successor Neriglissar lasted 4 years and died, possibly naturally. Neriglissar's son Labashi-Marduk ruled for 9 months before being overthrown in a coup. 3 kings in 7 years, none dying peacefully in old age. This was not the foundation for lasting empire. The coup brought Nabonidus to power in 556 BCE. He was not from the royal family. He was probably a nobleman with connections to the priesthood. His mother had been a high priestess. His rise to power suggests court intrigue and political maneuvering rather than clear succession. Babylon had a new king, but not everyone was happy about it. Nabonidus was unusual, even by the standards of ancient monarchs. He was deeply religious, but his religious interests didn't align with Babylon's traditional priesthood. He favored the moon god Sin over Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. This was problematic. Marduk's temple and priests were central to Babylonian identity and politics. A king who preferred a different god was making a statement that many found offensive. Then Nabonidus did something even stranger. He left Babylon and moved to Tama, an oasis in the Arabian desert. He stayed there for about 10 years. 10 years. His son Belshazzar ruled as regent in Babylon while Nabonidus remained in Arabia. Ancient sources offer various explanations. Maybe he was ill and seeking a better climate. Maybe he wanted to control Arabian trade routes. Maybe he was having religious visions. Maybe he was just eccentric. Whatever the reason, an absent king didn't inspire confidence. While Nabonidus was away, the world was changing. To the east, in what is now Iran, a new power was consolidating. The Persians. They had been subjects of the Median Empire, the same Medes who'd helped destroy Assyria. But around 550 BCE, a Persian king named Cyrus II rebelled against his Median overlord, defeated him, and took control of the Median Empire. Suddenly the Persians controlled a vast territory stretching from central Iran to eastern Anatolia. Cyrus was ambitious and talented. He spent the next decade expanding in every direction. He conquered Lydia in western Anatolia around 547 BCE, defeating King Croesus, who was legendary for his wealth. He conquered the Greek cities on the Anatolian coast. He subdued regions in Central Asia. He built an empire larger than anything since Assyria, and eventually he looked west toward Babylon. Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon from his decade-long Arabian sojourn around 543 BCE. He returned to a city that wasn't particularly happy to see him. The priests of Marduk resented his neglect of their god. The people questioned why their king had abandoned them for 10 years. Political and religious tensions were high. Babylon was divided and weak at exactly the moment it needed to be united and strong. Cyrus began his campaign against Babylon in 539 BCE. The Persian army was experienced, well-organized, and massive. The Babylonian army was demoralized and led by a king who'd spent a decade away from military affairs. The outcome was almost predictable. The sources describe the conquest with varying details, but the general pattern is clear. Persian forces moved through Babylonian territory with minimal resistance. Nabonidus marched out to meet them with an army. The Babylonian forces were defeated or simply melted away. Nabonidus fled. The Persian army advanced on Babylon itself. And then something remarkable happened. Babylon surrendered without a fight. The governor of Babylon, a man named Gobryas or Ugbaru, opened the gates to the Persian army. Cyrus entered the city peacefully. No siege, no destruction, no burning. Babylon, the greatest city in the world, simply changed ownership like a house being sold to new landlords. Why? The classical sources, particularly the Greek historian Herodotus, tell dramatic stories about the Persians diverting the Euphrates River and entering through the riverbed, while Babylonians were distracted by a festival. But contemporary sources suggest something simpler. Babylon's elite, particularly the priests of Marduk, preferred Persian rule to Nabonidus. They saw Cyrus as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Cyrus understood how to manage conquest through propaganda. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder with an inscription in Babylonian, presents him as chosen by Marduk to restore proper worship. Nabonidus is portrayed as impious and incompetent. Cyrus claims he entered Babylon peacefully, respected the gods, and restored proper religious practices. Whether this was entirely true or skillful propaganda probably doesn't matter. The message worked. Cyrus treated Babylon well. He didn't destroy temples or deport populations. He presented himself as a traditional Mesopotamian king, following established customs. He participated in Babylonian religious festivals. He used Babylonian administrative systems and kept many local officials in place. This was conquest through absorption rather than destruction. Nabonidus was captured. His fate is unclear. Some sources say he was executed. Others claim he was exiled to Carmania in eastern Iran, where he lived out his days in comfortable captivity. His son Belshazzar may have died defending Babylon, though the sources are contradictory. The Bible has a famous story about Belshazzar's feast and writing appearing on the wall predicting his downfall. Historical Belshazzar's end is less clear, but probably similar in outcome. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE marked the end of something significant. For 3,000 years, Mesopotamia had been the center of civilization. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, kings ruling from Babylon, Nineveh, Ashur, empires rising and falling but always centered on the land between the rivers, always independent or conquering others, never conquered by outsiders from distant lands. Now that was over. Babylon became a province in the Persian Empire. A wealthy, important province, but still just a province. The center of power had shifted. From now on, Mesopotamia would be ruled from elsewhere, from Persia, later from Greece, then from Rome, then from Islamic capitals. The age of Mesopotamian independence was finished. Cyrus also reversed Babylonian deportation policies. He allowed exiled peoples to return home. The Jews who'd been deported by Nebuchadnezzar were permitted to return to Jerusalem. This earned Cyrus extraordinary praise in Jewish tradition. The Bible calls him God's anointed, a Messiah sent to liberate the chosen people. Not many foreign conquerors get that kind of review. The Persian conquest was relatively gentle as conquests go. But it was still conquest. The last independent Mesopotamian empire was gone. 3 millennia of civilization had reached an endpoint. What happened next would be continuation rather than origin. Mesopotamia would remain important, wealthy, and culturally significant, but it would never again be independent. The story that began with rivers creating cities ended with a Persian king walking peacefully through Babylon's gates. What Mesopotamia left behind for everyone else. When Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BCE, he didn't just conquer a city, he inherited the accumulated knowledge, innovations, and cultural achievements of 3,000 years of civilization, and he kept them. The Persians were smart conquerors. They understood that Mesopotamia had developed systems worth preserving. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, administration, architecture, all of it continued under Persian rule, spreading even further across their vast empire. But Mesopotamia's influence didn't stop with the Persians. The ideas, technologies, and cultural practices developed between the Tigris and Euphrates spread across the ancient world and eventually reached us. We live in a civilization built partially on Mesopotamian foundations, whether we realize it or not. Start with writing. The Sumerians invented it around 3200 BCE to track grain deliveries and temple inventories. Boring administrative necessity that changed everything. Writing allowed knowledge to be preserved across generations. Laws could be recorded, stories could be saved, history could be documented. Every written language since, every book, every text message, traces back conceptually to Mesopotamian scribes pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. The alphabet we use today isn't Mesopotamian. It's descended from Phoenician scripts. But the Phoenicians lived in the Mesopotamian cultural sphere. They were influenced by cuneiform systems. They simplified the concept, reducing thousands of signs to a few dozen letters representing sounds. But the idea that marks on a surface can represent language, that came from Mesopotamia. Mathematics was another Mesopotamian gift. The Sumerians developed a sophisticated number system based on 60, base 60, not our familiar base 10. This is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. Why circles have 360 degrees. Mesopotamian mathematical conventions embedded so deeply in human culture that we use them without thinking about their origin. Mesopotamian mathematicians understood place value, the concept that a digit's value depends on its position. They could calculate square roots, solve quadratic equations, and work with geometric problems. Clay tablets show mathematical exercises that look surprisingly modern. Word problems about calculating field areas, dividing inheritances, and determining how long construction projects would take. Students 3,000 years ago were struggling with math homework just like students today. Astronomy was particularly advanced. Mesopotamian astronomers observed the sky systematically for centuries. They tracked planetary movements, predicted eclipses, identified constellations, and created star catalogues. They knew the difference between planets and stars. They calculated the length of the year with remarkable accuracy. Their observations were so detailed that modern astronomers can use Babylonian records to study historical astronomical events. The zodiac came from Mesopotamia. The idea that the sky is divided into 12 sections associated with different constellations and that these somehow relate to human affairs. Astrology might be scientifically questionable, but it's a Mesopotamian invention that remains popular worldwide. Every horoscope in every newspaper descends from Babylonian priests watching the night sky and interpreting celestial omens. The 7-day week is Mesopotamian. It's based on the 7 visible celestial bodies: the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each day was associated with one of these bodies. This system spread through the ancient world. The Romans adopted it. Christianity and Islam preserved it. Now it's essentially universal. The weekly cycle organizing modern life started with Mesopotamian astronomers. Law as written code accessible to the public, at least in theory, was Mesopotamian innovation. Hammurabi's code wasn't the first, but it was influential. The idea that laws should be written down, publicly displayed, and applied consistently was revolutionary. Earlier societies had customs and traditions. Mesopotamia created legal systems with specific written rules and documented cases. The concept of justice as proportional punishment came from Mesopotamia. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. This sounds harsh to modern ears, but it was actually progressive. It limited vengeance. You couldn't kill someone's entire family because they injured you. The punishment had to match the crime. This principle influenced legal thinking throughout the ancient world and eventually contributed to modern concepts of proportional justice. Urban planning was Mesopotamian. The idea of organizing cities with walls, gates, streets, public buildings, residential neighborhoods, and infrastructure like sewers and water systems. Mesopotamian cities weren't organic villages that grew randomly. They were planned spaces designed for thousands or tens of thousands of people to live together. Every modern city is conceptually descended from that Mesopotamian urban planning tradition. Architecture gives us arches, vaults, and domes, all developed or refined in Mesopotamia. These structural innovations allowed larger buildings and more complex spaces. Roman architecture borrowed heavily from Near Eastern precedents. Islamic architecture continued those traditions. Modern architecture still uses principles first worked out by Mesopotamian builders, figuring out how to construct temples that wouldn't collapse. Agriculture in Mesopotamia meant irrigation on a massive scale. Canals, dikes, reservoirs, and sophisticated water management. The techniques developed to farm in a difficult environment spread throughout the ancient world. Managing water resources, calculating field yields, crop rotation, these agricultural practices began in Mesopotamia and became standard farming knowledge. Literature began there. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the world's oldest surviving major literary work. It's not just historical, it's actually good. The story explores mortality, friendship, loss, and the meaning of life. Themes that remain relevant today. Gilgamesh influenced later literature. Elements of the epic appear in the Bible. Flood stories, heroic journeys, searches for immortality. Mesopotamian literature created narrative patterns that writers still use. Religion from Mesopotamia influenced the entire region. Monotheism developed partly in reaction to Mesopotamian polytheism. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all emerged in the Near East, influenced by the religious context Mesopotamia created. The Bible is full of Mesopotamian references. The Garden of Eden is placed near the Tigris and Euphrates. The Tower of Babel is probably the Ziggurat of Babylon. Abraham came from Ur. The Jewish exile happened in Babylon. You can't understand biblical religion without understanding its Mesopotamian context. Time measurement came from Mesopotamia, dividing the day into hours, hours into minutes. The lunar calendar used by many religious traditions. the sophisticated timekeeping necessary for agriculture, administration, and astronomy. Mesopotamians needed to measure time accurately and developed systems that spread worldwide. Even glassmaking was refined in Mesopotamia. The technique of creating glazed ceramics, those beautiful blue bricks on Babylon's Ishtar Gate, represented advanced materials technology. The knowledge of working with silica, understanding temperatures, creating colored glazes. These techniques spread to Egypt, then to Rome, eventually becoming standard craft knowledge. Mesopotamia's legacy isn't confined to museums, it's embedded in daily life. Every time you check what hour it is, you're using Mesopotamian time divisions. Every time you read anything, you're using a technology conceptually descended from cuneiform. Every time you live in a city, follow written laws, or look up your horoscope, you're participating in traditions that began between two rivers thousands of years ago. The empires fell, the cities were buried, the languages died, but the ideas survived. They spread, evolved, and became foundational to civilization worldwide. Mesopotamia ended politically when Cyrus conquered Babylon, but culturally, intellectually, and practically, Mesopotamia never really ended. It just became part of everything that came after. The rivers that created the world's first cities created something that lasted longer than any empire. They created the template for civilization itself.